Welcome, dear listeners, to Mystic Bedtime Stories, where the gentle whispers of history carry you into peaceful slumber. I'm your host, and tonight we embark on a journey through time, to a place where legends were born from the mists of dawn, where the echo of sandaled feet still resonates through marble corridors that have crumbled to dust centuries ago. Tonight, let us walk together along the ancient cobblestones of a city that once commanded the world. Close your eyes and breathe deeply. Feel the cool morning air as it drifts across the 7 hills of Rome, carrying with it the scent of olive groves and the distant murmur of the Tiber River as it winds its way through the eternal city. Here at Mystic Bedtime Stories, we believe that the most profound rest comes not from empty silence, but from the gentle rhythm of voices that have something meaningful to share. Our stories are crafted for those who seek more than mere entertainment in their evening hours. They are for souls who find comfort in the wisdom of ages, who understand that the greatest adventures often unfold not in the rush of day, but in the quiet contemplation of night. We know that life moves quickly around us. The demands of each day can feel overwhelming, the noise of modern existence sometimes drowning out the deeper currents of human experience. That's why we're here. In this sacred space between wakefulness and sleep, we offer you something different, something that honors both your need for rest and your hunger for meaning. Our channel is a sanctuary for mature minds, for those who have lived long enough to appreciate the profound patterns that weave through human history. Whether you're settling into bed after a long day or finding yourself restless in the small hours of the morning, we're here to accompany you on a journey that is both educational and deeply restful. Tonight's tale is one of transformation, of a small Italian city-state that grew to encompass the known world, leaving fingerprints on every aspect of our modern civilization. But we won't be rushing through dates and battles. Instead, we'll walk slowly through the centuries, allowing each moment to unfold naturally, like morning mist lifting from ancient forums. The story of Rome is, in many ways, the story of humanity itself. It's about ambition and hubris, about a delicate balance between order and chaos, about how civilizations rise through virtue and fall through excess. It's about individuals who changed the course of history, and about the countless unnamed people who built, fought, loved, and died in service of an idea that was larger than themselves. As we begin our journey, imagine yourself standing on the Palatine Hill as the first light of dawn touches the red-tiled roofs below. The year is uncertain, lost in the mists of legend, but the place is unmistakable. This is where it all began, where 2 brothers raised by wolves would establish a settlement that would outlast empires, whose laws would echo through millennia, whose very name would become synonymous with power and grandeur. The morning air is crisp, carrying the sounds of a waking city. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the lowing of cattle being driven to market, the creak of wooden wheels on stone, the soft murmur of prayers being offered at household shrines. These are the sounds of a civilization in its infancy, unaware that it will one day stretch from the foggy shores of Britain to the sun-baked sands of North Africa. But Rome was never just about conquest. It was about something deeper, something that resonated in the human soul. It was about the idea that scattered tribes could become a unified people, that chaos could be transformed into order, that human beings could create something lasting and beautiful that would outlive their own brief existence. This is what we'll explore together in the hours ahead. Not just the what and when of Roman history, but the why and how. We'll walk with senators in the forum, stand with legions on distant battlefields, and sit with philosophers in marble gardens. We'll witness the birth of laws that still govern, used today, and see how the echoes of Roman ambition still reverberate through our modern world. Our journey will be unhurried, like a leisurely stroll through a museum, where every artifact has a story to tell. We'll pause when something catches our attention, linger over details that illuminate the human condition, and allow the natural rhythm of the story to carry us forward without haste. So settle back now, dear listener. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Feel the weight of your body against your bed, the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your covers. You are safe here, in this moment, in this space we've created together. The ancient world is calling to you, not with the urgency of conquest, but with the gentle persistence of memory. Let us begin where all great stories begin, with a single moment that will echo through eternity. Let us begin with the whisper of wind across 7 hills, where the ghosts of empire still walk in the morning mist, and where the past and present meet in the eternal dance of human dreams. In the soft light of early morning, as the mist begins to lift from the Tiber's banks, we find ourselves drawn into a story that begins not with historical facts, but with the kind of legend that reveals deeper truths about the human heart. Is the year 753 before the Common Era? Though time itself seems different here, more fluid, more forgiving of the boundaries between myth and memory. Picture, if you will, a she-wolf emerging from the morning shadows along the riverbank. Her coat gleams silver in the dawn light, and in her gentle mouth she carries not prey, but hope itself. 2 infant boys, abandoned to the mercy of the gods, and the wilderness, have found an unlikely mother in this creature of the wild. Their names will echo through history. Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of what will become the greatest city the world has ever known. But tonight, they are simply 2 children being cared for by forces beyond human understanding. The she-wolf nurses them with a tenderness that speaks to something primal in the human soul, something that recognizes that civilization often begins not with grand plans, but with simple acts of unexpected mercy. As the years pass in our story, we watch these boys grow under the care of Faustulus, a shepherd whose kindness transforms their wild beginnings into something approaching nobility. They learn the skills of survival, yes, but also something more precious. They learn that strength without compassion is merely brutality, and that true leadership requires the wisdom to know when to fight and when to forgive. The legend tells that as young men, the brothers decided to found a city. But even in this act of creation, we see the seeds of conflict that will haunt human civilization throughout history. Romulus chooses the Palatine Hill, while Remus favors the Aventine. Each seeks signs from the gods to validate his choice, and in the interpretation of omens, we see the beginning of the political arts that will one day govern continents. The tragedy that follows is as old as humanity itself. In a moment of anger and pride, Romulus kills his brother, becoming both the founder and the first fratricide of Rome. This is not a story we tell to glorify violence, but rather to acknowledge that even the greatest human achievements often carry within them the shadows of our deepest failings. Yet from this dark beginning comes something remarkable. Romulus, perhaps haunted by his brother's death, dedicates himself to creating something larger than his own ambitions. He establishes not just a city, but an idea that people from different tribes, different backgrounds, different traditions can come together and forge a common identity. This is where Rome's genius first reveals itself. Other cities of the ancient world were built around exclusion, around the purity of blood and birth. But Rome, almost from its beginning, was different. Romulus opens his city to refugees, to outcasts, to anyone willing to embrace Roman values. He understands that a city's strength lies not in the homogeneity of its people, but in their shared commitment to something greater than themselves. The early Romans developed customs that will echo through the centuries. They learned to value duty over personal desire, to see themselves as guardians of something sacred that must be passed on to future generations. In their simple homes on the 7 hills, fathers teach sons that personal honor is meaningless unless it serves the common good. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of early Roman society is the relationship with their kings. Unlike the god kings of Egypt or the despots of other ancient civilizations, Roman kings rule by consent. They are chosen for their wisdom and ability, not their divine bloodline. This principle, planted in the earliest days of the city, will eventually blossom into something unprecedented in human history. The years flow by like the Tiber itself, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always moving forward. Rome grows from a collection of hilltop villages into a true city. Trade flourishes, alliances are forged with neighboring peoples, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Romans begin to develop the institutions that will one day govern the world. Under King Numa Pompilius, they learn the arts of peace. Religious. Ceremonies are codified, laws are written down, and the calendar itself is organized to reflect both the practical needs of farming and the spiritual rhythms of worship. These may seem like small things, but they represent something profound: the human desire to impose order on chaos, to create meaning from randomness. Successive kings add their own contributions to the growing city. Markets are established, sewers are built, and most importantly, the Roman military begins to take the disciplined form that will make it legendary. But always, underlying these practical developments, is a growing sense that Rome has a destiny larger than that of ordinary cities. The Romans develop what they call gravitas, a quality that combines dignity, responsibility, and an almost religious devotion to duty. It's not a grim seriousness, but rather a deep understanding that their actions have consequences beyond their own lives. This gravitas becomes the foundation of Roman character, the quality that will enable them to rule justly over diverse peoples for centuries. Yet by the 6th century before the Common Era, the Romans have grown restless under monarchy. They have tasted self-governance in their assemblies and councils, and they begin to chafe under the rule of even benevolent kings. The final straw comes with Tarquin the Proud, whose arrogance and cruelty violate every principle the Romans hold dear. The story of Lucretia, a Roman noblewoman who takes her own life rather than live with the shame of being violated by Tarquin's son, becomes the catalyst for revolution. But this is not a revolution driven by mob fury. Instead, it's led by men like Lucius Junius Brutus, who understands that lasting change requires not just the destruction of the old order, but the careful construction of something better. In 509 BCE, the Romans do something remarkable. They don't simply replace one king with another. Instead, they create an entirely new form of government, one based on the revolutionary principle that no single person should hold absolute power. They establish the Republic, from the Latin res publica, meaning the public thing or the people's affair. The genius of the Roman Republic lies not in its perfection, but in its recognition of human imperfection. The Romans understand that power corrupts, so they divide it. They create 2 consuls instead of 1 king, each able to check the other's authority. They establish the Senate as a council of elder statesmen whose wisdom can guide policy. They create assemblies where ordinary citizens can make their voices heard. Most importantly, they establish the principle of term limits. No one, no matter how capable or popular, can hold power indefinitely. This ensures that Rome belongs not to any individual, but to all Romans, present and future. As we close this first chapter of our journey, imagine yourself standing once again on the Palatine Hill. But now in the year 509 BCE, the city spread. Below you is no longer the simple settlement founded by Romulus. It has grown into something unprecedented, a republic where laws matter more than the whims of rulers, where citizenship brings both rights and responsibilities, where the common good takes precedence over individual ambition. The morning mist is beginning to clear, and in the growing light, you can see the future stretching out before this remarkable city. There will be triumphs and disasters, moments of glory and periods of darkness. But the foundation has been laid, not just in stone and timber, but in principles and ideals that will outlast any individual life. The Roman Republic stands ready to test itself against the world, armed not just with swords and shields, but with something far more powerful, the conviction that free people, working together under just laws, can accomplish things that no tyrant ever could. The adventure is just beginning, and the best is yet to come. As the sun climbs higher over the 7 hills, we find ourselves in the early years of the Roman Republic, when the city's ambitions were still modest, and its territory barely extended beyond the sight of a watchman standing on the Capitol. Yet, even in these humble beginnings, we can sense the stirring of something greater, like the first movement of wind that will eventually become a storm. The Italy of the 5th century before the Common Era is a tapestry of peoples and cultures, each thread distinct, yet somehow destined to be woven together under Roman guidance. To the north, the Etruscans maintain their ancient cities, masters of metalwork and divination, their tombs filled with the artwork of a sophisticated civilization. To the south, Greek colonies dot the coastline like jewels, bringing the wisdom of Athens and the beauty of Hellenic culture to Italian shores. Between these great powers, scattered across the peninsula's mountains and valleys, live the Italic tribes, the Sabines with their fierce independence, the Aqui in their mountain strongholds, the Volsci guarding the southern approaches to Rome. Each group has its own customs, its own gods, its own proud traditions stretching back through generations uncounted. Into this complex world steps the young Roman Republic, not yet the conquering giant of later centuries, but something perhaps more admirable, a community guided by principles rather than mere ambition. The Romans of this era fight not for glory or plunder, but for something they call securitas, the security that comes from knowing your neighbors are either your friends or too weak to threaten you. But Roman security is unlike that sought by other ancient peoples. Where others build walls and hide behind them, the Romans prefer to extend their protection outward, creating a network of alliances and partnerships that grows like ripples in a pond. This is their genius, this understanding that true security comes not from isolation, but from integration. The first great test comes with the Latin League, Rome's closest neighbors who share similar languages and customs. These are not strangers to be conquered, but cousins to be convinced. The Romans approach them not with ultimatums, but with propositions. Join us, they say, and together we will be stronger than any of us could be alone. Fight with us in war, and share with us in peace. This is revolutionary thinking for the ancient world. Most conquerors of the time sought to dominate and exploit their subjects. The Romans, by contrast, offer something unprecedented: partnership. They create the concept of foedus, the treaty alliance that transforms enemies into allies, strangers into citizens. The wars that follow are not the grand campaigns of later Roman history, but smaller, more personal conflicts where honor matters as much as victory. We see Roman generals like Cincinnatus, who leaves his plow to lead Rome's armies, and returns to farming as soon as the crisis passes. This is the Roman ideal in its purest form: service to the state as a duty, not an opportunity for personal aggrandizement. Against the Aqui and the Volsci, Roman discipline meets mountain warfare. These are not the set-piece battles of professional armies, but the grinding campaigns of farmers-turned-soldiers, men who understand that every field they fight in could be their own. The Romans learn patience in these wars, learning to build camps each night that are small cities unto themselves, complete with walls, gates, and ordered streets. More importantly, they learn the art of assimilation. When a tribe submits to Rome, they are not enslaved or expelled. Instead, they are offered a path to Roman citizenship, a chance to become part of something larger than their tribal identity. This is not mere generosity, it is wisdom. The Romans understand that a willing ally is worth 10 conquered enemies. The Etruscan wars present a different challenge. Here, Rome faces not wild tribes, but an ancient civilization with cities older than Rome itself. Veii, just 12 miles from Rome, commands trade routes in farmland that Rome needs for its growing population. The siege of Veii becomes a test of Roman character, lasting 10 years and requiring the kind of sustained effort that lesser peoples might abandon. But the Romans have something their enemies lack: institutional memory. Their Senate provides continuity of purpose across generations, ensuring that what one consul begins, another can continue. When the siege finally succeeds, it is not through a single heroic act, but through the accumulated weight of Roman persistence. The victory at Veii demonstrates another Roman innovation: the integration of defeated enemies into their own society. The Etruscan nobility who submit are not humiliated or exiled, but offered positions in Roman society commensurate with their abilities. Etruscan knowledge of engineering and divination enriches Roman culture, while Etruscan manpower strengthens Roman armies. This pattern repeats across the peninsula. The Samnites, fierce mountain warriors who might have been Rome's greatest enemies, instead become some of their most reliable allies after a series of hard-fought wars. The Romans learned Samnite tactics, adopt Samnite equipment, and welcome Samnite commanders into their ranks. Each campaign teaches the Romans something new about the art of war and the science of governance. In the mountains, they learn flexibility and adaptation. On the plains, they perfect their famous manipular system, organizing their legions into smaller, more maneuverable units. Against the Greeks of southern Italy, they encounter professional military thinking and adopt what serves them while discarding what does not. But perhaps the most important lesson the Romans learn is demographic. Italy is not empty land waiting to be settled, but a peninsula full of peoples who can become Romans if treated with justice and respect. Each victory brings not just territory, but citizens. Each alliance brings not just security, but strength. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, something remarkable has happened. The Roman Republic has grown from a single city to a confederation, spanning most of the Italian peninsula. Yet this is not an empire in the traditional sense, built on the subjugation of conquered peoples. Instead, it is something new under the sun, a voluntary association of communities bound together by shared law and mutual benefit. The Roman road system begins to take shape during this period, not merely as military highways, but as arteries of communication and commerce that bind the peninsula together. A merchant in Brundisium can travel to Rome under the protection of Roman law, conducting business with Roman currency, speaking Latin to Roman officials, who may themselves have been born in a dozen different Italian cities. The Italian peoples, once divided by language, custom, and mutual suspicion, begin to see themselves as something new: Italians. Not because they have been forced to abandon their local identities, but because those identities have been enriched by participation in something larger. A Samnite warrior can serve in a Roman legion while still honoring his tribal gods. An Etruscan noble can serve in the Roman Senate while maintaining his family's ancient traditions. This transformation is gradual, almost imperceptible, like the way morning mist gives way to the clarity of full daylight. There is no single moment when Italy becomes Roman, but rather a slow process of mutual adoption and adaptation that leaves everyone changed, but no one conquered. As we close this chapter of our journey, imagine yourself standing not on the Palatine Hill, but on the Via Appia, the great road that stretches from Rome to the heel of Italy. The sun is setting behind you, casting long shadows across the carefully fitted stones that will bear traffic for centuries to come. Along this road, armies have marched and merchants have traveled. Ideas have spread and cultures have mingled. In the growing twilight, you can almost see the ghosts of all those who helped build this remarkable achievement. Roman engineers laying out the roadbed, Samnite workers quarrying stone, Etruscan craftsmen shaping the milestones, Greek architects designing the bridges. This is not the conquest of Italy, but its transformation into something new and unified. The road stretches ahead into darkness, but also into possibility. Beyond the horizon lie greater challenges and greater opportunities. The wealthy cities of Sicily, the maritime empire of Carthage, and eventually the wider world itself. But for now, in this moment of peaceful accomplishment, we can appreciate what has already been achieved, the creation of a unified Italy based not on fear, but on hope. As our journey through Roman history continues, we find ourselves at the shores of the Mediterranean, where the gentle lapping of waves against ancient harbors whispers of adventures and conflicts that will reshape the world. The year is 264, before the Common Era, and Rome, having unified the Italian peninsula, now gazes across the narrow strait that separates Sicily from the mainland. Here, fate has arranged a meeting between two civilizations so different in character, yet so similar in ambition that their collision will echo through the ages. Carthage, the great Phoenician city of North Africa, sits like a jewel on the coast of what we now call Tunisia. Founded by refugees from Tyre centuries earlier, it has grown into something magnificent, a maritime empire whose purple-sailed ships carry trade goods from the Atlantic coasts of Spain to the cedar forests of Lebanon. The Carthaginians are merchants and explorers, their wealth built on commerce rather than conquest, their power projected through naval supremacy rather than legionary discipline. Not, in many ways, Carthage represents an alternative path of civilization, one based on trade and negotiation rather than law and administration. Where Romans build roads and establish colonies, Carthaginians establish trading posts and commercial networks. Where Romans seek to transform their subjects into citizens, Carthaginians prefer tributary relationships that preserve local autonomy while ensuring profitable commerce. The contrast is stark and perhaps inevitable. Rome, the land power with its citizen soldiers and its dream of ordered expansion, stands face to face with Carthage, the sea power with its mercenary armies and its vision of commercial dominion. Between them lies Sicily, a triangular island that controls access to both the eastern and western Mediterranean. The First Punic War begins almost by accident, as great conflicts sometimes do. The city of Messina, perched on Sicily's northeastern tip, appeals to both Rome and Carthage for protection against local tyrants. What follows is not the result of grand strategy, but of two powers discovering that they cannot coexist in the same sphere without collision. For Rome, this represents something unprecedented, their first war beyond the Italian mainland. The Romans who crossed the strait to Sicily are still essentially farmers and shepherds who have learned to fight, men more comfortable on solid ground than on the rolling deck of a warship. Yet here, they find themselves committed to a struggle that will require them to become something they have never been, a naval power. The Romans approach this challenge with characteristic thoroughness. Unable to match Carthaginian seamanship through experience, they decide to transform naval warfare into something more familiar. They invent the corvus, a boarding bridge that allows their ships to grapple enemy vessels and turn sea battles into infantry combats. It is typically Romo, taking an unfamiliar problem and solving it through discipline, engineering, and adaptation. The war drags on for 23 years, longer than any conflict in Roman memory. Fleets are built and lost. Battles are won and forgotten, and gradually, both sides learn that this struggle is about more than Sicily. It is about which vision of Mediterranean civilization will prevail: the Roman model of integration and expansion, or the Carthaginian model of commercial hegemony and indirect control. The Romans demonstrate a quality that will serve them well in the centuries to come, an almost inexhaustible capacity to absorb losses and continue fighting. When their fleets are destroyed by storms, they build new ones. When their armies are defeated, they raise fresh legions. This is not mere stubbornness, but something deeper, a national conviction that temporary setbacks cannot alter ultimate destiny. The First Punic War ends with Roman victory, but it is a victory that teaches both sides valuable lessons. The Romans learn that they can indeed become a naval power when necessity demands it. The Carthaginians learn that Rome is not merely another Italian city-state, but a force of nature that will not be deterred by conventional calculations of cost and benefit. Sicily becomes Rome's first province, marking a fundamental shift in Roman thinking. No longer content with the alliance system that served them in Italy, the Romans begin to experiment with direct administration of conquered territory. It is a momentous change, one that will eventually transform the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. 23 years of uneasy peace follow, years filled with mutual suspicion and preparation. Carthage expands its influence in Spain, building new cities and recruiting new armies from the fierce Iberian tribes. Rome watches nervously, understanding that this is not genuine peace, but merely an intermission between acts of a larger drama. The Second Punic War begins with the arrival of a name that will haunt Roman dreams and inspire Roman determination in equal measure. Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, the Carthaginian general who has sworn eternal enmity to Rome. Hannibal is everything the Romans are not: brilliant, unpredictable, willing to take risks that would appall a Roman commander. Yet in some ways, he understands Rome better than the Romans understand themselves. The siege of Saguntum, Rome's ally in Spain, provides the spark, but the fire has been building for a generation. When Hannibal begins his legendary march from Spain to Italy, he is not merely leading an army. He is leading a test of everything Rome has built. His route takes him through southern Gaul and over the Alps in winter, a journey so audacious that it enters the realm of myth even as it unfolds. Picture, if you will, that extraordinary procession winding through the mountain passes. Carthaginian officers in their purple cloaks, Spanish infantry with their short swords and circular shields, Numidian cavalry on their swift horses, and most memorable of all, the war elephants, those living symbols of exotic power, stepping carefully along icy precipices where one false step means death. The Alps claim more than half of Hannibal's army, but those who survive the crossing are transformed into something legendary. They are no longer merely soldiers, but survivors of an impossible journey, men who have seen their general achieve the unachievable. When they descend into the Po Valley and see the rich fields of northern Italy spread before them, they know they are part of something that will be remembered forever. The Roman response to Hannibal's invasion reveals both their greatest strengths and their most dangerous weaknesses. Their strength lies in their systematic approach to warfare: careful recruitment, thorough training, methodical planning. But faced with Hannibal's genius for improvisation and psychological warfare, these strengths sometimes become rigidities. At the Trebia River, Roman discipline meets Carthaginian cunning. Hannibal baits the Roman consul into battle on ground of his choosing, in weather that favors his African troops over the shivering Romans. The defeat is crushing, but not decisive. The Romans retreat, regroup, and prepare to try again. Lake Trasimene represents Hannibal at the height of his tactical brilliance. Using the morning mist as cover, he positions his army along the hills overlooking the lake, then waits as the Roman army marches unknowingly into the trap. When the mist clears, the Romans find themselves surrounded, with the lake at their backs, and enemies on all sides. It is a masterpiece of battlefield psychology, turning the Romans' own confidence against them. Yet even in defeat, Roman character shines through. The consul Flaminius dies fighting in the front ranks, sword in hand. The survivors do not break and run, but maintain formation even in hopeless circumstances. This is what Hannibal is fighting: not just an army, but a way of thinking that cannot conceive of ultimate surrender. After Trasimene, Rome turns to Quintus Fabius Maximus, whom history will remember as the delayer. Fabius understands what many of his contemporaries do not, that Hannibal's army, for all its tactical brilliance, is ultimately unsustainable. Cut off from Carthaginian supplies and reinforcements, it must live off the land and fight with whatever forces it brought from Spain. The Fabian strategy is deeply unpopular with Romans, who prefer decisive action to patient waiting. But it represents Roman strategic thinking at its most sophisticated, the understanding that sometimes the best way to win is to refuse to lose until circumstances change in your favor. Fabius shadows Hannibal's army, cutting off stragglers, threatening supply lines, and gradually wearing down the invader through attrition. But Roman impatience eventually overrules Roman wisdom. At Cannae, the largest army Rome has ever assembled marches out to end the war with a single decisive battle. What follows is perhaps the most perfect tactical victory in military history. Hannibal allows the Roman center to advance, then envelops it with his wings, creating what military historians call the perfect double envelopment. The slaughter at Cannae is so complete that it enters Roman collective memory as a synonym for disaster. Entire legions disappear. The flower of Roman nobility perishes. For a brief moment, it seems that Roman expansion has ended where it began, on the battlefields of Italy. Yet Cannae, paradoxically, marks the beginning of Hannibal's ultimate defeat. The Romans refuse to surrender, refuse even to negotiate. Instead, they do what they have always done. They raise new armies, adopt new strategies, and continue fighting. They begin to apply the lessons of Fabius more systematically, avoiding pitched battles while striking at Carthaginian allies and supply lines. More importantly, they begin to take the war to Carthage itself. Roman armies land in Spain, threatening Carthaginian power at its source. Roman diplomacy works to isolate Carthage from potential allies. The war becomes a struggle of attrition. And in such struggles, Rome's systematic approach to warfare gives them an inherent advantage. The end comes at Zama, in North Africa, where Scipio Africanus meets Hannibal in a battle that will determine the fate of the Mediterranean world. It is fitting that these two great generals, each representing the best of his civilization, should face each other on the field where everything will be decided. Zama is Rome's answer to Cannae. Using Hannibal's own tactics against him, Scipio divides his forces and uses Numidian cavalry to attack the Carthaginian flanks. The war elephants, once symbols of exotic terror, are turned against their own masters. When the battle ends, Carthaginian power in the Mediterranean has ended with it. The Second Punic War concludes with terms that ensure Carthage will never again threaten Rome. The Carthaginian fleet is burned. Their territories are ceded, and massive indemnities are imposed. Yet there is something almost tragic about this victory. In defeating Carthage, Rome has eliminated not just an enemy, but an alternative vision of what Mediterranean civilization might have become. The Third Punic War, fought more than 50 years later, is less a war than an execution. Carthage, rebuilt as a commercial center, but stripped of military power, represents no threat to anyone. Yet Roman suspicion, crystallized in Cato's famous phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed," leads to a siege that ends with the complete obliteration of the ancient city. As we conclude this chapter of our journey, we stand amid the smoking ruins of what was once the greatest commercial center in the ancient world. The harbor that once sheltered hundreds of purple-sailed ships is choked with rubble. The libraries that preserved centuries of Phoenician wisdom have been burned. The people who created a civilization based on trade and exploration have been scattered to the winds. Yet, in this destruction, we see also the birth of something new. Rome is no longer merely an Italian power, but the dominant force in the Mediterranean world. The lessons learned in 3 generations of warfare with Carthage have transformed Roman society, creating professional armies, systematic administration, and the confidence to project power across vast distances. The boy soldiers who crossed into Sicily in 264 BCE have become the masters of an empire that stretches from Spain to Syria. The farmers who learned to build warships to fight Carthage have become the inheritors of the entire Mediterranean basin. In defeating their greatest rival, the Romans have discovered their own destiny. As the moon rises over the ruins of Carthage, casting silver light on broken walls and silent harbors, we can almost hear the whisper of history itself, reminding us that every ending is also a beginning, and that the greatest victories often carry within them the seeds of transformation that no victor can foresee. The evening mist rolls softly across the 7 hills of Rome, carrying with it the whispers of a republic beginning to show the first deep cracks in its marble foundations. Tonight, we find ourselves walking through the shadows of the late 2nd century before Christ, when the very virtues that had built Rome so magnificently were slowly being twisted into something darker, something that would change the course of history forever. Picture, if you will, the Forum Romanum at twilight. The great columns still stand proud and tall, their shadows stretching long across the worn stones where countless feet have walked for generations. But there's a tension in the air now, a restlessness that wasn't there in Rome's earlier, simpler days. The merchants close their stalls with hurried movements. The senators speak in hushed, urgent tones. And even the pigeons seem to sense that something fundamental is shifting in the heart of the eternal city. For nearly 4 centuries, the Roman Republic had grown from a small city-state into the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. Its armies had marched triumphantly across distant lands. Its ships had sailed to every corner of the known world, and its eagles had cast their shadows over peoples from Britain to North Africa. But success, as we often discover in the quiet hours of reflection, can be as dangerous as failure. And Rome was about to learn this lesson in the most painful way possible. The wealth that poured into Rome from its conquered territories was beyond anything the early Romans could have imagined. Gold from Spain glittered in the darkness of newly built villas. Silk from distant China rustled in the bedchambers of the wealthy. Spices from India perfumed the air of elaborate banquets that lasted from sunset to sunrise. But this river of riches, instead of strengthening the bonds between Roman citizens, began to wash away the very foundations of the Republic itself. In the old days, when Rome was still fighting for survival against its neighbors, every citizen had shared in both the struggles and the victories. A senator might own a small farm outside the city walls, working it with his own hands when he wasn't serving in the legions or debating in the forum. A common soldier could return from campaign to find his plot of land waiting for him, perhaps a little overgrown with weeds, but still his own. Rich and poor alike understood that they rose or fell together, that Rome's strength came from the unity of its people. But now, as the Mediterranean trade routes carried their treasures to Rome's doorstep, that ancient unity began to dissolve. Like salt in water, the wealthy discovered that they could buy vast estates worked by slaves captured in the endless wars. Why labor in the fields yourself when thousands of conquered peoples could do it for you? They built mansions that sprawled across entire hillsides, with gardens that recreated the landscapes of Egypt and Asia, with dining rooms that could hold 100 guests at once. Meanwhile, the small farmers who had once formed the backbone of Rome's armies found themselves unable to compete with slave-worked plantations. Many had spent years away from home, fighting in distant lands for Rome's glory, only to return and discover that their fields had been neglected. Their debts had grown like weeds, and their neighbors had already sold their ancestral lands to wealthy speculators from the city. These displaced farmers drifted into Rome itself, joining a growing crowd of unemployed citizens who filled the narrow streets and cramped tenements. They survived on free grain distributed by politicians seeking their votes, spending their days in idleness while the work they had once done was performed by slaves from across the empire. The proud citizen soldiers who had conquered the world became a restless mob, easily swayed by any demagogue who promised them easy answers to their complex problems. It was into this troubled world that two brothers stepped forward, driven by a vision of justice that would ultimately tear the Republic apart. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were not common men. Born into one of Rome's most distinguished families, they could have lived lives of comfortable privilege, enjoying the fruits of conquest without concerning themselves with the suffering around them. But they possessed something that would prove both noble and dangerous, a burning desire to restore Rome to its ancient virtues. Tiberius, the elder brother, looked out across the Roman countryside and saw vast estates where once had stood the small farms of citizen soldiers. He listened to the complaints of displaced veterans and heard in their voices an echo of Rome's fading greatness. In 133 B.C., as tribune of the plebs, he proposed a radical solution: redistribute the public lands that had been monopolized by the wealthy, giving every Roman citizen a chance to own a small plot, and restore the citizen farmer class that had made Rome great. The idea was simple, even elegant. Rome possessed vast territories seized from conquered enemies, lands that legally belonged to the Roman people as a whole. Yet these public lands had been occupied for generations by wealthy families who treated them as their private property, passing them down from father to son while paying only nominal rents to the state. Tiberius proposed to reclaim these lands and distribute them in small parcels to landless citizens, creating a new generation of farmer soldiers loyal to the Republic. But simplicity in concept proved to be complexity in practice. The wealthy families who had built their fortunes on these occupied lands had no intention of giving them up without a fight. They had invested heavily in buildings, orchards, and improvements, they argued. They had employed thousands of slaves and freedmen whose livelihoods depended on the existing system. Most importantly, they possessed something that the landless masses did not: political power. The Roman Senate, dominated by men whose wealth came from exactly the sort of large estates that Tiberius sought to break up, opposed his reforms with every tool at their disposal. They declared his proposals illegal. They blocked his legislation through procedural maneuvers, and they accused him of seeking to become a tyrant who would destroy the ancient constitution of the Republic. Tiberius, frustrated by the Senate's obstruction, made a fateful decision. He would appeal directly to the popular assembly, bypassing the traditional channels of Roman government. In doing so, he opened a door that could never be closed again. For the first time since the founding of the Republic, a Roman politician had chosen to pursue his agenda by setting one part of the government against another. By appealing to the masses against the established elite, the confrontation came to a head during the summer of 133 B.C., as Tiberius sought re-election as tribune to continue his reforms. Tensions in the city reached a breaking point. On the day of the election, as citizens gathered in the Campus Martis to cast their votes, rumors spread that Tiberius was planning to seize power and make himself king. The word rex, king, was the most feared word in the Roman vocabulary, carrying with it memories of the tyrannical Tarquin monarchs who had been overthrown centuries earlier. A group of senators, led by the Pontifex Maximus, decided that desperate times called for desperate measures. Armed with clubs and stones, they marched from the Temple of Jupiter to where Tiberius was addressing his supporters. In the violence that followed, Tiberius and 300 of his followers were killed, their bodies thrown into the Tiber River like common criminals. For the first time in 4 centuries, Roman blood had been shed in the streets of Rome by Roman hands. The sacred principle that political disputes should be settled through debate and voting, not violence, had been shattered. A republic had survived external enemies, foreign invasions, and military disasters. But it had never faced anything like this, the spectacle of its own leaders turning to murder to resolve their differences. 10 years later, Gaius Gracchus, the younger brother, was elected tribune and attempted to complete his brother's work. He was more skilled than Tiberius, more politically astute, and he initially succeeded in building a broader coalition of support. He extended citizenship to Rome's Italian allies, established subsidized grain distributions for the urban poor, and created new opportunities for the middle classes in the provinces. For a moment, it seemed as though the Republic might heal its wounds and find a new path forward. But the same forces that had destroyed Tiberius were still at work. The wealthy elite, terrified of losing their privileges, painted Gaius as an even greater threat than his brother had been. They stirred up fears among ordinary citizens that he was planning to flood Rome with foreign immigrants who would take their jobs and dilute their status. They spread rumors that he was preparing to move the capital of the empire away from Rome itself. The end came in 121 BC, in what could only be called a civil war fought on the streets of the Eternal City. Gaius and his supporters took refuge on the Aventine Hill, one of Rome's 7 sacred hills, while his enemies surrounded them with armed slaves and foreign mercenaries. In the fighting that followed, Gaius died alongside 3,000 of his followers. Once again, the Tiber ran red with Roman blood. The immediate crisis had passed, but the damage to the Republic was irreversible. The precedent had been set. When political opponents could not be defeated through traditional means, they could be eliminated through violence. The sacred boundaries that had once limited political competition had been crossed, and there was no going back. Into this poisoned atmosphere stepped 2 men whose rivalry would tear the very heart out of the Roman Republic, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. They began as allies, both reformers who sought to strengthen Rome in their own ways. But their partnership would evolve into a hatred so intense, a competition so ruthless, that it would make the conflicts of the Gracchi seem like mere rehearsals for the real tragedy to come. Marius was something entirely new in Roman politics, a new man who had risen to prominence through his own merit rather than through the advantages of birth. Born in the hill town of Appianum, 60 miles south of Rome, he was not even a true Roman citizen by the old standards. His family had wealth, but no pedigree, influence, but no ancient name. In the traditional Roman system, such a man might hope to serve as a junior magistrate, or perhaps command a single legion, but the highest offices of state were reserved for the established aristocratic families who traced their lineages back to the founding of the Republic. But Marius possessed qualities that the old aristocracy often lacked: brilliant military instincts, ruthless ambition, and an intuitive understanding of what the common soldiers wanted to hear. He had served with distinction in the wars against Jugurtha in North Africa, where he had witnessed firsthand the corruption and incompetence of aristocratic commanders who treated warfare as a gentleman's hobby, rather than a serious profession. When Marius was elected consul in 107 BC, he immediately implemented military reforms that would change the nature of Roman power forever. The old citizen militia, where farmers and shopkeepers served for a single campaign before returning to their civilian lives, was transformed into a professional army of landless volunteers who served for decades under the same commander. These soldiers, having no property or trade to return to, became completely dependent on their general for their livelihood and their future. Marius promised his veterans something that the state had never provided before: land grants and pensions after their service. In return, they gave him a loyalty that transcended their allegiance to Rome itself. When Marius commanded, they obeyed without question, even when his orders conflicted with the wishes of the Senate or the traditional authorities. For the first time in Roman history, the legions belonged more to their commander than to the Republic. The immediate results were spectacular. Marius's professional legions crushed the Cimbri and Teutones, Germanic tribes whose invasions had threatened to destroy Rome itself. They swept through North Africa, bringing Jugurtha back to Rome in chains. They put down slave revolts and pacified rebellious provinces with the efficiency that the old citizen militia had never achieved. Marius was hailed as the savior of Rome, elected consul an unprecedented 7 times, and granted triumphs that surpassed even those of the great conquerors of the past. But the seeds of future disaster were already planted in Marius's success. His soldiers, loyal to him personally rather than to the state, had become a private army in all but name. His veterans, settling on lands distributed through his influence, formed political blocs that could swing elections and intimidate opponents. Most dangerously of all, Marius had shown that a skilled general with loyal troops could bend the traditional institutions of the Republic to his will. Sulla, Marius's former lieutenant, watched these developments with the calculating eye of a born aristocrat. Where Marius was rough and direct, Sulla was subtle and sophisticated. Where Marius appealed to the emotions of the masses, Sulla understood the intricate mechanisms of law and tradition. He had served under Marius as a young man, learning the arts of war and politics, but he represented everything that the old Marius despised: ancient bloodlines, inherited privilege, and an unshakable belief that Rome should be governed by its traditional elite. The breaking point came over a seemingly minor issue: who would command the war against Mithridates, the dangerous king of Pontus, who threatened Rome's eastern provinces. The Senate, dominated by Sulla's aristocratic allies, awarded the command to Sulla himself. But Marius, now old but still ambitious, used his influence with the popular assemblies to have the command transferred to himself instead. For Sulla, this was not merely a political setback, but a fundamental violation of the constitutional order. He had been legally appointed by the proper authorities, and now a mob of ignorant citizens, manipulated by a demagogue, was attempting to overturn the decision. If such precedents were allowed to stand, he believed the Republic would descend into chaos where might made right and traditional law meant nothing. Sulla made a decision that shocked even his own supporters. Instead of accepting the popular will, as Roman tradition demanded, he marched his legions directly on Rome itself. For the first time in the Republic's 400-year history, a Roman army entered the sacred city as an occupying force. Citizens fled their homes as soldiers in full battle gear took control of the Forum, the Senate House, and the temples where the gods of Rome were worshipped. Marius and his supporters were driven into exile, their property confiscated, their names added to lists of public enemies. Sulla departed for his eastern campaign, leaving behind a city that would never be quite the same. The unthinkable had become reality. Roman soldiers had drawn their swords against Roman citizens in the heart of the eternal city itself. But Sulla's absence created a vacuum that Marius's supporters quickly moved to fill. Led by the consul Cinna, they seized control of Rome and recalled Marius from exile. Now it was Sulla's turn to be declared a public enemy, his property seized, his family threatened with violence. When Marius re-entered Rome at the head of his own army, the streets ran red with the blood of Sulla's supporters. The old general, consumed by years of hatred and resentment, unleashed a reign of terror that shocked even his own allies. For several days and nights, gangs of Marius's soldiers roamed through Rome, searching for anyone who had supported Sulla or opposed their return. They burst into homes where families were gathered for their evening meals, dragging senators and magistrates into the streets where they were butchered like animals. They looted temples and public buildings, treating the sacred city as though it were a conquered enemy rather than their own homeland. Marius himself, now nearly 70 years old, seemed driven by demons that no victory could satisfy. He had achieved everything a Roman could hope for: military glory, political power, wealth beyond measure. But it was not enough. He wanted not merely to defeat his enemies, but to destroy them utterly, to erase their very existence from the memory of Rome. The end came mercifully quickly for the old general. Within weeks of his return to power, Marius died in his bed, some said from drink, others from the sheer exhaustion of maintaining so much hatred for so long. But his death did not bring peace to Rome. His followers, having tasted blood, were reluctant to return to the mundane business of governance. They controlled the city through fear and violence, ruling not as magistrates elected by the people, but as an occupying army in their own homeland. When Sylla finally returned from his eastern victories, loaded with the treasures of Asia, and followed by legions hardened by years of warfare, the stage was set for a conflict that would dwarf all previous civil wars. This would not be a riot in the streets or a clash between rival gangs, but a systematic campaign to determine once and for all whether Rome would be governed by law or by force. The final war between Sylla and his enemies lasted for 3 years. From 83 to 81 BC, it was fought not in distant provinces against foreign enemies, but in the fertile fields and ancient cities of Italy itself. Roman legions, using tactics perfected against barbarian tribes and eastern kingdoms, now deployed them against each other with a efficiency that was both magnificent and horrifying. Sylla's advantages were clear from the beginning. His soldiers were veterans of successful campaigns, disciplined, and loyal to their commander. His cause, the restoration of traditional senatorial government, appealed to Romans who were exhausted by years of chaos and bloodshed. Most importantly, he possessed what his enemies lacked: a clear vision of what Rome should become after the war was won. The battles were fought with a savagery that had never been seen in earlier Roman conflicts. At the Colline Gate, just outside Rome itself, Sylla's legions faced the combined armies of his enemies in a battle that lasted from dawn to midnight. When the sun rose the next morning, 50,000 Romans lay dead on the field, their blood soaking into the same soil that their ancestors had farmed for generations. Sylla's victory was complete, but he was not content merely to defeat his enemies. He was determined to make such a war impossible in the future by eliminating not just the leaders who had opposed him, but anyone who might be tempted to follow their example. He instituted what he called proscriptions, official death lists posted throughout the city, naming hundreds of citizens who were declared enemies of the state. Any Roman whose name appeared on these lists could be killed by anyone, with the killer receiving a reward from Sylla's treasury. Their property was confiscated, their families stripped of citizenship, their very names forbidden to be spoken in public. For months, Rome lived under a reign of terror as citizens checked the daily postings to see if their own names had been added to the lists of the condemned. The scope of the killing was beyond anything Rome had ever experienced. Senators who had opposed Sylla, magistrates who had supported his enemies, even wealthy citizens whose only crime was possessing property that Sylla's supporters coveted, all found themselves marked for death. Some fled to distant provinces, abandoning everything they had built in hopes of surviving until the madness passed. Others attempted to hide in Rome itself, disguising themselves as slaves or beggars while their former palaces were ransacked by Sylla's agents. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Sylla's proscriptions was their systematic nature. This was not the random violence of a mob or the passionate revenge of a wronged individual. It was calculated, organized, bureaucratic murder, carried out with the same efficiency that Rome brought to building roads or organizing provinces. Lists were carefully maintained, rewards precisely calculated, bodies disposed of with military precision. When the killing finally stopped, Rome had been transformed beyond recognition. An entire generation of political leaders had been eliminated, their places taken by men whose primary qualification was loyalty to Sylla. The Senate, once a body of experienced statesmen representing centuries of accumulated wisdom, had been reduced to a collection of yes-men who voted as their dictator commanded. Sulla himself seemed almost surprised by the extent of his own power. He had become what no Romano had been since the last king was expelled 4 centuries earlier, the absolute ruler of the Roman world, answerable to no law except his own will. He held the ancient title of dictator, but with none of the traditional limitations that had once confined that office to brief periods of emergency. And yet, in the strangest twist of all, Sulla chose to give up his power voluntarily. After reorganizing the government according to his vision, strengthening the Senate at the expense of the popular assemblies, and establishing legal barriers to prevent future demagogues from rising to power, he simply resigned his dictatorship and retired to private life. Some said he was exhausted by the weight of absolute power. Others that he believed his reforms would be permanent and saw no need to continue ruling personally. A few whispered that he had been warned by soothsayers that his death was approaching, and chose to spend his final days in the pleasures of retirement rather than the burdens of governance. Whatever his reasons, Sulla's retirement marked the end of an era. He had saved the Republic from chaos and restored traditional government, but at a cost that few had anticipated. The methods he had used to achieve victory, marching on Rome, proscribing enemies, ruling as dictator, had become part of the political toolkit available to ambitious Romans. The precedents had been set, the boundaries crossed, the unthinkable made thinkable. Within a generation, other ambitious men would follow Sulla's example, but with different goals and fewer scruples. They had learned the lessons he taught, that the Roman people would accept any government that brought peace and stability, that the legions would follow any commander who promised them rewards, and that the ancient constitution of the Republic could be bent to serve the will of any man, strong enough to seize control of it. As the evening light fades over the 7 hills, casting long shadows across the Forum, where so much history has played out, we can see in Sulla's career both the grandeur and the tragedy of the Roman spirit. He was a man who loved the Republic enough to destroy it in order to save it, who restored order through chaos, who preserved tradition by overturning every precedent that had made Rome great. The Republic would survive for another half-century, producing some of its greatest achievements in literature, law, and conquest. But the cancer that had begun with the Gracchi and metastasized under Marius and Sulla could never be fully removed. Each new crisis would be met with increasingly desperate measures. Each new strong man would push the boundaries a little further, until finally the ancient forms would be abandoned entirely, and Rome would become what Sulla had temporarily made it, an empire ruled by the will of a single man. But for now, in this quiet moment between the storms, Rome sleeps uneasily in the shadows of its glorious past and its uncertain future. The gods watch from their temples, the ancestors whisper from their tombs, and history holds its breath, waiting to see what new tragedy or triumph the dawn will bring to the eternal city. The stars shine with unusual brightness tonight over the eternal city, as if the heavens themselves wish to illuminate the story we are about to tell. It is a tale that has echoed through the centuries, whispered in theaters and written in books, sung by poets and remembered by dreamers. Tonight, we follow the footsteps of perhaps the most famous Roman who ever lived, a man whose very name became synonymous with power itself. Gaius Julius Caesar. Picture, if you will, a misty morning in the year 100 before Christ. In a modest but respectable house on the Subura, one of Rome's more colorful neighborhoods, a child takes his first breath. The midwives who attend his birth cannot know that they are witnessing the arrival of someone who will change the course of human history. They see only another baby, crying lustily in the pre-dawn darkness, unaware that his name will still be spoken 2,000 years later in languages not yet invented. The Rome into which young Caesar was born was a city caught between its glorious past and an uncertain future. The civil wars of Marius and Sulla had ended, but their scars remained visible in the rebuilding temples and the careful way people spoke of politics in public. It was a time when ambition was both rewarded and feared, when a man could rise to the highest offices of state, but only if he navigated carefully between the competing factions that had torn the Republic apart. Caesar's family, the Iuli, claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, through her son Aeneas, the legendary founder of the Roman race. Such claims were common among the old patrician families, part of the elaborate mythology that surrounded Rome's elite. But in Caesar's case, this divine ancestry would prove to be more than mere boasting. He possessed a quality that seemed almost supernatural, the ability to inspire absolute devotion in his followers while maintaining the perfect balance between confidence and charm that marks a born leader. As a young man, Caesar showed little hint of the greatness that awaited him. He was handsome in the way that Roman aristocrats were expected to be, well educated as befitted his station, and possessed of that easy grace that comes from never having to worry about money or position. He married young to a girl named Cornelia, daughter of one of Marius's supporters, and seemed destined for the sort of comfortable career that awaited most men of his class: a few minor magistracies, perhaps a governorship in some peaceful province, and a quiet retirement surrounded by grandchildren and olive trees. But fate, or perhaps the gods, had other plans for Caesar. When Sulla returned to Rome as dictator, Caesar found himself in a dangerous position. His marriage to Cornelia marked him as a supporter of Marius's faction, and Sulla demanded that he divorce her immediately. It was a simple request, the sort of political accommodation that ambitious young men made every day in Rome. Divorce the girl, marry someone more suitable, and your career will proceed smoothly. Caesar's response revealed something essential about his character. He refused. Despite threats, despite the knowledge that his refusal could mean exile or death, he would not abandon the woman he had married. It was a gesture that might have been romantic foolishness or noble principle, but it marked Caesar as a man who would not compromise his personal honor for political advantage. This trait would serve him well in the years to come, when lesser men would bend and break under the pressures of power. Forced to leave Rome to avoid Sulla's wrath, Caesar spent several years in the East, serving with distinction in minor military campaigns and learning the arts of war that would make him one of history's greatest generals. When news came that Sylla had died, Caesar returned to a Rome that was slowly healing from its wounds, ready to begin the career that had been interrupted by civil war. Caesar's rise through the traditional ladder of Roman offices was steady, but not spectacular. He served as quaestor in Spain, where he first displayed the financial acumen that would later enable him to fund his armies and his ambitions. He served as aedile in Rome, organizing gladiatorial games that were still talked about years later for their magnificence and expense. Each position he held, he transformed through the force of his personality and his understanding of what the Roman people truly wanted. But it was during his consulship in 59 BC that Caesar first revealed the full scope of his ambitions. Frustrated by his colleagues' opposition to his proposals, Caesar essentially ignored the other consul and governed Rome single-handedly for an entire year. He pushed through land reforms that benefited his supporters, arranged profitable provincial commands for his allies, and laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most audacious military campaigns in human history. For Caesar had arranged for himself the governorship of Gaul, the wild lands beyond the Alps where Celtic tribes lived in their ancient ways, largely untouched by Roman civilization. To most senators, this seemed like a comfortable exile, a place where Caesar could enrich himself modestly while staying out of Roman politics for a few years. They could not have imagined that this scholarly aristocrat would transform himself into one of the most brilliant military commanders who ever lived. The Gallic Wars began almost by accident. Celtic tribes, feeling pressure from Germanic peoples pushing westward, appealed to Rome for protection. It was exactly the sort of minor border dispute that could have been settled with a few diplomatic missions and modest bribes. But Caesar saw something more, an opportunity to win the kind of military glory that had made heroes of Marius and Pompey, and to fill Rome's treasury with the wealth of an entire continent. What followed was 8 years of almost continuous warfare. That would make Caesar's reputation and provide him with the resources to challenge the Republic itself. But these were not the brutal, grinding campaigns of earlier Roman wars. Caesar fought with a combination of tactical brilliance, personal courage, and psychological insight that left his enemies reeling, and his own soldiers convinced that they served under a general touched by the gods themselves. Consider the siege of Alesia, where the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix made his final stand against Roman conquest. Faced with a fortified hilltop city that seemed impossible to take by direct assault, Caesar did something that no general before him had ever attempted. He built 2 sets of walls around the city, one facing inward to prevent the defenders from escaping, and another facing outward to protect his own army from the massive relief force that was marching to break the siege. The stars shine with unusual brightness tonight over the eternal city, as if the heavens themselves wish to illuminate the story we are about to tell. It is a tale that has echoed through the centuries, whispered in theaters and written in books, sung by poets and remembered by dreamers. Tonight, we follow the footsteps of perhaps the most famous Roman who ever lived, a man whose very name became synonymous with power itself. Gaius Julius Caesar. Picture, if you will, a misty morning in the year 100 before Christ. In a modest but respectable house on the Subura, one of Rome's more colorful neighborhoods, a child takes his first breath. The midwives who attend his birth cannot know that they are witnessing the arrival of someone who will change the course of human history. They see only another baby, crying lustily in the pre-dawn darkness, unaware that his name will still be spoken 2,000 years later in languages not yet invented. The Rome into which young Caesar was born was a city caught between its glorious past and an uncertain future. The civil wars of Marius and Sulla had ended, but their scars remained visible in the rebuilding temples and the careful way people spoke of politics in public. It was a time when ambition was both rewarded and feared, when a man could rise to the highest offices of state, but only if he navigated carefully between the competing factions that had torn the Republic apart. Caesar's family, the Iuli, claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself through her son Aeneas, the legendary founder of the Roman race. Such claims were common among the old patrician families, part of the elaborate mythology that surrounded Rome's elite. But in Caesar's case, this divine ancestry would prove to be more than mere boasting. He possessed a quality that seemed almost supernatural, the ability to inspire absolute devotion in his followers while maintaining the perfect balance between confidence and charm that marks a born leader. As a young man, Caesar showed little hint of the greatness that awaited him. He was handsome in the way that Roman aristocrats were expected to be, well educated as befitted his station, and possessed of that easy grace that comes from never having to worry about money or position. He married young to a girl named Cornelia, daughter of one of Marius's supporters, and seemed destined for the sort of comfortable career that awaited most men of his class: a few minor magistracies, perhaps a governorship in some peaceful province, and a quiet retirement surrounded by grandchildren and olive trees. But fate, or perhaps the gods, had other plans for Caesar. When Sulla returned to Rome as dictator, Caesar found himself in a dangerous position. His marriage to Cornelia marked him as a supporter of Marius's faction, and Sulla demanded that he divorce her immediately. It was a simple request, the sort of political accommodation that ambitious young men made every day in Rome. Divorce the girl, marry someone more suitable, and your career will proceed smoothly. Caesar's response revealed something essential about his character. He refused. Despite threats, despite the knowledge that his refusal could mean exile or death, he would not abandon the woman he had married. It was a gesture that might have been romantic foolishness or noble principle, but it marked Caesar as a man who would not compromise his personal honor for political advantage. This trait would serve him well in the years to come when lesser men would bend and break under the pressures of power. Forced to leave Rome to avoid Sulla's wrath, Caesar spent several years in the East, serving with distinction in minor military campaigns and learning the arts of war that would make him one of history's greatest generals. When news came that Sylla had died, Caesar returned to a Rome that was slowly healing from its wounds, ready to begin the career that had been interrupted by civil war. Caesar's rise through the traditional ladder of Roman offices was steady, but not spectacular. He served as quaestor in Spain, where he first displayed the financial acumen that would later enable him to fund his armies and his ambitions. He served as aedile in Rome, organizing gladiatorial games that were still talked about years later for their magnificence and expense. Each position he held, he transformed through the force of his personality and his understanding of what the Roman people truly wanted. But it was during his consulship in 59 BC that Caesar first revealed the full scope of his ambitions. Frustrated by his colleagues' opposition to his proposals, Caesar essentially ignored the other consul and governed Rome single-handedly for an entire year. He pushed through land reforms that benefited his supporters, arranged profitable provincial commands for his allies, and laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most audacious military campaigns in human history. For Caesar had arranged for himself the governorship of Gaul, the wild lands beyond the Alps where Celtic tribes lived in their ancient ways, largely untouched by Roman civilization. To most senators, this seemed like a comfortable exile, a place where Caesar could enrich himself modestly while staying out of Roman politics for a few years. They could not have imagined that this scholarly aristocrat would transform himself into one of the most brilliant military commanders who ever lived. The Gallic Wars began almost by accident. Celtic tribes, feeling pressure from Germanic peoples pushing westward, appealed to Rome for protection. It was exactly the sort of minor border dispute that could have been settled with a few diplomatic missions and modest bribes. But Caesar saw something more, an opportunity to win the kind of military glory that had made heroes of Marius and Pompey, and to fill Rome's treasury with the wealth of an entire continent. What followed was 8 years of almost continuous warfare. That would make Caesar's reputation and provide him with the resources to challenge the Republic itself. But these were not the brutal, grinding campaigns of earlier Roman wars. Caesar fought with a combination of tactical brilliance, personal courage, and psychological insight that left his enemies reeling, and his own soldiers convinced that they served under a general touched by the gods themselves. Consider the siege of Alesia, where the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix made his final stand against Roman conquest. Faced with a fortified hilltop city that seemed impossible to take by direct assault, Caesar did something that no general before him had ever attempted. He built 2 sets of walls around the city, one facing inward to prevent the defenders from escaping, and another facing outward to protect his own army from the massive relief force that was marching to break the siege. But perhaps most importantly, Caesar began to present himself not merely as a successful general or skilled politician, but as something approaching divinity. He allowed statues of himself to be placed in temples alongside the gods' accepted honors that had previously been reserved for the immortals, and spoke of his relationship with Venus not as a poetic metaphor, but as literal truth. To many Romans, this transformation from citizen to god-king represented everything that the Republic had been founded to prevent. The conspiracy that would end Caesar's life grew slowly. nurtured by men who genuinely believed they were saving Rome from tyranny. Marcus Brutus, whom Caesar loved almost as a son, found himself torn between personal loyalty and what he saw as his duty to the Republic. Cassius, driven by a mixture of republican principle and personal ambition, provided the organizational skills that turned vague dissatisfaction into concrete action. The conspirators convinced themselves that they were acting from the noblest motives, that removing Caesar would allow the Republic to return to its ancient traditions of shared power and collective decision-making. They failed to understand that the Republic they sought to restore had been dying for generations, weakened by the same social and economic forces that had enabled Caesar's rise to power. The end came on the Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 BC, during a Senate session at the Curia of Pompey. The conspirators, numbering between 60 and 70 individuals, and led by Marcus Junius Brutus, surrounded Caesar as he took his seat, their daggers hidden beneath their togas. The attack was swift and brutal. Caesar, taken completely by surprise, fought briefly against his assailants before realizing the hopelessness of his situation. Ancient historians tell us that his last words, spoken to Brutus in Greek, were, "You too, my child?" A phrase that captures both his personal betrayal and his recognition that even those he trusted most had turned against him. Caesar fell at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling on the marble floor of the theater that his former rival had built. It was a death that seemed orchestrated by fate itself. The great general brought low not in battle against foreign enemies, but by the daggers of men he had called friends, in a building dedicated to the memory of the only Roman who had ever matched his greatness. The conspirators had planned Caesar's death with meticulous care, but they had given little thought to what would happen afterward. They seemed to believe that removing Caesar would automatically restore the Republic, that the Roman people would welcome a return to the old system of senatorial government and collective leadership. They could not have been more wrong. The news of Caesar's assassination spread through Rome like wildfire, carried by slaves and freedmen who had no love for the senators who had killed their patron. The common people who had benefited from Caesar's reforms and had looked forward to further improvements in their lives were outraged by his murder. The soldiers who had served under him and owed their fortunes to his generosity began to speak openly of revenge. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and closest political ally, seized the initiative with a funeral oration that transformed Caesar from a dead dictator into a martyred hero. Speaking over Caesar's body in the Forum, Antony displayed the blood-stained toga and read from Caesar's will, which left generous bequests to every Roman citizen. By the time he finished speaking, the crowd was calling for the blood of the conspirators, and several of them had already fled the city in fear for their lives. But the most significant consequence of Caesar's death was the emergence of his grandnephew and adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, who would take the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus and eventually become the Emperor Augustus. This young man, barely 18 years old when his great-uncle died, possessed the same combination of political intelligence and ruthless ambition that had made Caesar great, but he had learned from Caesar's mistakes about the dangers of appearing too powerful too quickly. The civil wars that followed Caesar's assassination would rage for another 13 years, as various factions fought for control of the Roman world. Antony and Octavian would initially cooperate in hunting down Caesar's killers, but would eventually turn against each other in a final struggle that would end with Octavian as the sole ruler of Rome, the republic that the conspirators had hoped to save would never return, replaced instead by an imperial system that would endure for centuries. As we reflect on Caesar's extraordinary life, we see in him both the highest possibilities and the greatest dangers of human ambition. He was a man of genuine genius, a military commander whose tactical innovations are still studied in military academies, a politician whose understanding of mass psychology was centuries ahead of his time, and a reformer whose vision of a unified Mediterranean world would shape the development of Western civilization. But he was also a man who believed that the normal rules did not apply to him, who confused his own desires with the will of the gods, and who ultimately preferred the role of divine monarch to that of citizen and senator. His crossing of the Rubicon was simultaneously the most decisive and the most destructive act in Roman history, opening the door to an empire that would achieve greatness beyond imagination, while closing forever the Republican experiment that had made such greatness possible. Tonight, as the stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns, we can almost hear the echo of Caesar's footsteps on the stones of the Forum, the sound of his voice addressing the Senate, the clash of swords at Alesia and Pharsalus. He was a man who lived so intensely, who achieved so much, and who died so dramatically that his story has become part of the mythology of power itself, that every ambitious politician who claims to serve the people while gathering power to himself, in every general who believes that military success qualifies him for political leadership, in every ruler who confuses his own will with the will of the state, we see something of Caesar's shadow falling across the centuries. His life reminds us that individual greatness, however magnificent, is no substitute for the collective wisdom of free institutions, and that even the most brilliant leader can become a tyrant if he loses sight of the difference between serving his country and owning it. The Forum is quiet now, bathed in silver moonlight that makes the ancient stones seem to glow with their own inner light. The ghosts of senators and citizens, of soldiers and slaves, of the great and the humble, all seem to whisper their stories to anyone willing to listen. And among them all, the spirit of Caesar himself, still walking the streets of the city he loved and conquered, transformed and destroyed, his legacy as complex and contradictory as the man himself. In the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, Rome found herself standing at a crossroads, shrouded in uncertainty. The conspirators who had struck down the great general believed they had saved the Republic, but instead they had opened the door to something far grander and more enduring. The city that had grown from 7 humble hills was about to become the heart of an empire that would stretch from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. Picture, if you will, the young Octavian, barely 18 years old, when his great-uncle Julius Caesar was murdered on that fateful Ides of March. He was studying in Apollonia, across the Adriatic Sea, when word reached him that Caesar was dead, and that he, this slight youth with intelligent eyes, had been named as Caesar's heir and adopted son. The will that would change the world had been read, and suddenly this teenager found himself inheriting not just Caesar's name and fortune, but the very destiny of Rome herself. The news must have felt like a thunderclap in a clear sky. One moment, Octavian was a young Roman noble, pursuing his education in Greek rhetoric and philosophy. The next, he was being summoned to claim one of the most dangerous inheritances in history. Caesar's veterans looked to him for leadership. Caesar's enemies marked him for destruction. And Caesar's allies, including the powerful Mark Antony, viewed him with a mixture of skepticism and barely concealed contempt. What could this untested boy possibly accomplish where the mighty Caesar had failed? But there was something special about young Octavian, something that revealed itself not in grand gestures or battlefield heroics, but in patience, calculation, and an almost supernatural understanding of human nature. Where Caesar had been bold and direct, Octavian was subtle and strategic. Where Caesar had moved like lightning, Octavian moved like the tide, seemingly gentle, but ultimately irresistible. When he arrived in Rome to claim his inheritance, the city was in chaos. The conspirators had fled. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and close friend, had assumed he would naturally step into Caesar's role as the most powerful man in Rome. The Senate, meanwhile, hoped that with Caesar gone, they could somehow restore the old ways, the old balance of power that had made Rome great centuries before. Into this turbulent scene stepped Octavian, and he did something that surprised everyone. Rather than demanding immediate recognition, rather than flexing his inherited political muscles, he proceeded with careful, almost deferential respect for the established order. He called himself simply Gaius Julius Caesar, taking his adoptive father's name as was traditional, but he made no immediate claims to special authority. He honored his debts, paid Caesar's veterans their promised bonuses from his own pocket, and spoke always of duty to Rome rather than personal ambition. This careful approach was not weakness, but wisdom beyond his years. Octavian understood something that the other players in Rome's political drama had forgotten, that real power comes not from fear or force alone, but from the genuine consent and trust of the people. He watched as Mark Antony grew increasingly autocratic, as the conspirators struggled to justify their actions to an unconvinced public, as various factions schemed and plotted. And slowly, methodically, he began to position himself as Rome's reasonable alternative, the young man who would become. Augustus had learned the lesson of his adoptive father's death, that in Rome it was not enough to be powerful. One had to appear legitimate, traditional, and respectful of Roman sensibilities. Caesar had been killed not because he was weak, but because he had moved too quickly, changed too much too fast, and frightened those who feared the loss of their ancient privileges. Octavian would not make the same mistake. The first test of his political acumen came when he formed an unlikely alliance with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, Caesar's other trusted lieutenant. This second triumvirate, as historians would later call it, was a power-sharing arrangement that gave each man control over different parts of Rome's growing empire. But unlike the informal alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus years earlier, this triumvirate was legally recognized by the Roman people, a careful touch that showed Octavian's growing understanding of how to wield power while appearing. To respect tradition together, the three men hunted down Caesar's assassins, pursuing them across the Mediterranean in a campaign that would culminate in the Battle of Philippi. There, on the plains of Macedonia, where Alexander the Great had once been born, the last defenders of the old Roman Republic made their final stand. Brutus and Cassius, the noble senators who had struck down Caesar, believing they were saving Rome from tyranny, chose death rather than capture when their cause was lost. But victory over Caesar's killers was only the beginning of Octavian's journey. The triumvirate that had been forged in necessity soon began to fracture under the weight of ambition and geography. Lepidus proved weak and was eventually sidelined. That left Octavian controlling the western half of Rome's empire, while Mark Antony ruled the east. For nearly a decade, these two titans circled each other like gladiators in the arena, each building strength, each waiting for the moment to strike. Mark Antony's downfall came through his love affair with Cleopatra, the brilliant and beautiful Queen of Egypt. Their romance was genuine. History suggests they truly loved each other, but it played directly into Octavian's hands. Here was Mark Antony, Roman general and supposed heir to Caesar's legacy, abandoning Roman virtues for foreign luxury, surrounding himself with oriental splendor, and worst of all, threatening to make his foreign queen partner in ruling Rome, Octavian. Meanwhile, remained in Rome, careful to present himself as the defender of traditional Roman values. When civil war finally came, it was not presented as a struggle between two Romans for supreme power, but as a defense of Rome herself against foreign corruption. The propaganda was masterful, and when the two great fleets met at Actium off the coast of Greece, Octavian's victory was as much political as military. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC marked the end of the Roman Republic, though few realized it at the time. When Cleopatra and Antony fled the battlefield and later took their own lives in Alexandria, Octavian found himself the undisputed master of Rome and all her territories. At barely 32 years old, he controlled an empire that stretched from Spain to Egypt, from the Rhine to the Sahara. The question now was what to do with this unprecedented power. Lesser men might have proclaimed themselves king or dictator, following the example of Caesar or any number of previous strongmen. But Octavian had been watching and learning for over a decade. He had seen how Caesar's monarchical ambitions had led to his assassination. He understood that Romans, even after a century of civil wars, still cherished their republican traditions and the fiction of self-governance. So in 27 BC, Octavian did something unprecedented in the history of power politics. He appeared before the Roman Senate and formally offered to give up all his extraordinary powers and return to being a simple private citizen. It was theater. Of course, carefully orchestrated theater. The Senate, faced with the prospect of renewed chaos without his stabilizing presence, immediately begged him to reconsider. They offered him a new title, Augustus, meaning the revered one, and granted him extraordinary honors while carefully avoiding any title that smacked of monarchy. Now, this was the moment when the Roman Empire was truly born, not in conquest or revolution, but in a carefully choreographed performance that allowed everyone to pretend that nothing fundamental had changed. Augustus accepted the Senate's honors with apparent reluctance, taking only the powers he needed to serve Rome effectively. He became princeps, first citizen, a title that suggested leadership without tyranny. He was granted imperium over the frontier provinces where Rome's legions were stationed, giving him control of the military. He received tribunician power, allowing him to propose legislation and protect the common people. Most importantly, he did all this while leaving the traditional offices and honors of the Republic intact. The Senate continued to meet, though they rarely opposed Augustus's wishes. The consuls were still elected each year, though Augustus influenced the elections. The old rituals and ceremonies continued, though they now served to legitimize Augustus's rule rather than limit it. It was a masterpiece of political innovation, a system that gave one man the power of a king while maintaining the forms and ceremonies of a republic. Augustus had squared the circle that had destroyed Caesar. He had found a way to rule absolutely while appearing to govern constitutionally. The results were transformative. After decades of civil war, Rome suddenly found herself at peace. Augustus laid the foundation for this period of concord, which also extended to North Africa, and what historians would later call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, began. For the first time in generations, Roman soldiers were not marching against other Romans. The legions instead turned their attention to securing and expanding the empire's frontiers. Augustus dramatically enlarged the empire, annexing Egypt, Dalmatia, Pannonia, Noricum, and Rhaetia, expanded possessions in Africa, as well as into Germania, and completed the conquest of Hispania. But these were campaigns of consolidation rather than conquest for its own sake. Augustus understood that Rome needed to digest what she had already conquered before reaching for more. The transformation was not merely military or political. It was cultural and architectural as well. Augustus expanded the Roman Forum and oversaw the construction of more than a dozen new temples, a new Senate house, and public halls. The city that had grown organically over centuries was reimagined and rebuilt as the conscious symbol of a new age. Marble replaced brick, grand boulevards replaced narrow streets, and magnificent public buildings proclaimed Rome's glory to all who entered her gates. Augustus was quoted as saying, "I found a city of brick and left it one of marble." And this transformation reflected not just his personal taste, but his understanding that empire required not just power but pageantry, not just force but magnificence. Rome had to look like the capital of the world if she was to be accepted as such. The peace that Augustus established was not merely the absence of war. It was the active creation of prosperity and stability across the known world. He embarked on extensive public works projects, constructing 50,000 miles of new roads, bridges, and aqueducts to facilitate trade and communication. These roads became the arteries of empire, carrying not just Roman legions, but Roman merchants, Roman laws, Roman ideas to every corner of the Mediterranean world. Trade flourished as never before. A merchant in Britain could sell his goods in Egypt, with confidence that Roman law would protect his contracts and Roman roads would speed his cargo. A farmer in Gaul could export his grain to feed the growing population of Rome itself. An artisan in Syria could find customers for his wares from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. The empire became a vast common market where prosperity could grow and spread. Augustus established the form of government now known as a principate, which meshed elements from the republic that were already in place with the traditional power of a monarchy. This hybrid system proved remarkably durable, lasting in various forms for centuries. Future emperors would modify it, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. But the basic structure Augustus created would endure. Perhaps most remarkably, Augustus lived to see his system work. He ruled for 45 years, dying peacefully. In his bed at the age of 75, an almost unprecedented fate for a Roman leader in that turbulent age. When he passed away in 14 AD, the succession passed smoothly to his stepson Tiberius, proving that the Augustan system could survive even the death of its creator. As we reflect on Augustus's extraordinary achievement, we can see how one young man's patience, wisdom, and deep understanding of human nature transformed not just Rome, but the entire course of Western civilization. The empire he founded would spread Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman literature, and eventually Roman Christianity to peoples who had never heard of the 7 hills where it all began. The boy who had inherited Caesar's name and fortune had given Rome something Caesar never could, not just power, but stability. Not just conquest, but peace. Not just dominance, but a system of government that could endure. In doing so, he had transformed himself from Octavian, the uncertain heir, into Augustus, the revered founder of a new age. The Pax Romana was beginning, and with it, Rome would reach heights of glory that would echo through history long after the last emperor had fallen and the last legion had marched away. But that is a story for our next chapter. For now, let us rest in the knowledge that sometimes, in the grand sweep of history, the right person appears at exactly the right moment to guide humanity towards something greater than what came before. With Augustus firmly established as emperor, the Roman world began to experience something it had not known for generations: peace. Not merely the absence of war, but a deep, abiding tranquility that allowed civilization itself to flourish like flowers after a long winter. The Pax Romana, lasting roughly 200 years, became identified as a golden age of increased Roman prosperity, relative peace and order, and regional expansion. Picture yourself standing on the Palatine Hill in Rome during those early decades of the empire as the sun rises over a city transformed. The sounds that greet the dawn are no longer the preparation for battle, the sharpening of swords, or the hurried counsels of war. Instead, you hear the gentle rhythm of construction, the tapping of hammers, the calls of workmen, the creaking of pulleys as marble blocks are lifted into place. Rome is building, not destroying. She is creating, not conquering. The genius of the Pax Romana lay not simply in ending warfare, but in creating something positive in its place. Augustus and his successors understood that peace is not a passive state. It must be actively cultivated, carefully maintained, and constantly renewed through wise governance and genuine prosperity. They set about creating a world where peace would be more profitable than war, where cooperation would bring greater rewards than conflict. The most visible symbol of this new age was Rome's extraordinary network of roads. Over 50,000 miles of paved highways began to stretch across the empire, like the blood vessels of some great living organism, carrying not armies bent on conquest, but merchants seeking trade, officials ensuring justice, and ordinary people pursuing the simple dream of a better life. These roads were marvels of engineering, straight as arrows were possible, paved with stones that would last for centuries, built with foundations so solid that many still carry traffic today, 2,000 years later. Not to travel these roads was to experience the true meaning of Roman peace. A merchant from Britain could journey to Egypt with confidence that his goods would be protected, his contracts honored, and his person secure. Along the way, he would sleep in comfortable inns, refresh himself at public baths, and conduct his business in forums built to the same grand design, whether he was in Spain or Syria. The empire had become a vast common market where prosperity could flow as freely as water through an aqueduct. And what aqueducts they built! These graceful stone giants marched across valleys and mountains, carrying the lifeblood of civilization, clean, fresh water, into the heart of every Roman city. In Rome herself, 11 great aqueducts brought hundreds of millions of gallons of water daily to a population that had grown to over 1 million souls. Public fountains sparkled in every neighborhood. The great public baths, those cathedrals of Roman social life, welcomed citizens of every class to relax in pools of perfectly heated water while discussing philosophy, conducting business, or simply enjoying the pleasure of cleanliness and companionship. The baths themselves were monuments to the Roman genius for combining utility with beauty. Step inside the baths of Caracalla, and you would find yourself in a building larger than most cathedrals, its soaring vaults decorated with mosaics that caught and reflected the light from dozens of windows. Here were pools of various temperatures, exercise yards, libraries, and meeting rooms. Here Roman citizens could spend entire days in comfort and luxury that would not be equaled in Europe for more than 1,000 years after Rome's fall. But the true glory of the Pax Romana was not merely in its monuments, magnificent though they were. It was in the quiet revolution that transformed daily life across the known world. For the first time in human history, a person could travel from one end of a vast empire to another and find everywhere the same legal protections, the same standards of construction, the same commitment to public order and individual rights. Roman law became the foundation upon which this peaceful world was built. The empire protected and governed individual provinces, permitting each to make and administer its own laws while accepting Roman taxation and military control. This was not the harsh uniformity of conquest, but the flexible strength of a system that could adapt to local customs while maintaining universal principles of justice. A farmer in Gaul enjoyed the same legal protections as a senator in Rome. A merchant in Africa could appeal to the same courts that served the citizens of Italy. The economic prosperity that flowered during the Pax Romana was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Trade routes that had been dangerous or impassable during the centuries of warfare now bustled with commercial activity. Goods flowed from one end of the empire to another with an ease that would not be matched again until the modern era. British wool found its way to Roman togas. Spanish silver paid for Chinese silk. Egyptian grain fed the growing populations of a dozen provincial cities. This prosperity was not limited to the wealthy or the well-connected. Archaeological evidence shows that even ordinary people enjoyed a standard of living that was remarkably high for the ancient world. Houses were built with glass windows, mosaic floors, and central heating systems. Pottery and metalwork reached levels of craftsmanship that combined beauty with practical utility. People ate well, dressed comfortably, and had access to entertainment and education that had once been reserved for the elite. The amphitheaters and circuses that dotted the Roman world were not merely venues for spectacular entertainment, though they certainly provided that. They were symbols of a society prosperous enough to devote enormous resources to public pleasure, confident enough in its stability to gather tens of thousands of people in one place for peaceful enjoyment. The great Colosseum in Rome, seating 50,000 spectators, was an engineering marvel that could be flooded for naval battles, or transformed into an elaborate stage for theatrical productions. Its sophisticated system of elevators and trapdoors allowed for spectacles that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Yet perhaps even more impressive than the grand spectacles were the quieter achievements of Roman civilization during this golden age. Public libraries opened in cities across the empire, making the treasures of Greek and Roman literature available to anyone who could read. Schools proliferated, teaching not just the children of the wealthy, but creating opportunities for bright young people from every social class to advance through merit and education. The arts flourished as never before. This was the age of Virgil's Aeneid, that great epic poem that transformed Roman origin myths into a work of literature that could stand beside Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. It was the time of Ovid's playful and sophisticated poetry, of Livy's monumental history of Rome, of Tacitus's penetrating analyses of power and human nature. Roman artists learned from their Greek predecessors, but developed their own distinctive style, creating portraits of startling realism and architectural monuments of unprecedented grandeur. Architecture during the Pax Romana reached heights that would not be surpassed for more than a millennium. The Pantheon, with its magnificent dome that seems to float weightlessly above the perfect circle of its interior, stands today as testimony to the engineering genius of Roman builders. Its dome, constructed entirely of concrete, was the largest in the world for more than 1,300 years. Standing beneath it, looking up at the perfect circle of light streaming through the opening at its apex, visitors still feel the sense of awe and mystery that Roman architects intended. Roman engineering transformed not just the appearance of the ancient world, but its very possibilities for human habitation. Swamps were drained and turned into fertile farmland. Harbors were built or improved to accommodate the ever-growing volume of trade. Bridges spanned rivers that had been barriers to commerce for centuries. The Via Appia, a queen of roads, allowed travelers to journey from Rome to the ports of southern Italy in comfort and safety, while other highways connected every major city in the empire to this central artery of communication and trade. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the Pax Romana was its treatment of the diverse peoples who found themselves under Roman rule. Unlike many empires which sought to obliterate local cultures and impose uniform customs, Rome developed a genius for integration. Local gods were welcomed into the Roman pantheon. Local customs were respected as long as they did not conflict with Roman law. Local leaders were incorporated into the Roman administrative system, creating a vast network of capable governors and officials who understood both Roman principles and local needs. This policy of integration reached its culmination in 212 AD, when Emperor Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. With a stroke of his pen, millions of people who had been conquered became Romans, with all the rights and protections that citizenship entailed. It was one of the most extraordinary acts of political inclusion in human history, transforming an empire held together by force into a commonwealth united by shared identity and common purpose. The Roman legions, meanwhile, evolved from instruments of conquest into guardians of peace. Stationed along the frontiers from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the great river barriers of the Rhine and Danube, they served more as police than as armies. Their very presence deterred potential invaders, while their engineering skills continued the work of civilization. Roman soldiers built roads, fortifications, aqueducts, and entire cities. They served not just as warriors, but as teachers, bringing Roman technology and Roman law to the furthest reaches of the known world. Within the empire's borders, crime became rare not through harsh punishment, but through prosperity and opportunity. When people could earn a comfortable living through honest work, when they could appeal to fair courts for justice, when they could rise in society through merit rather than birth, the temptations of banditry and rebellion largely disappeared. The Roman peace was real because it was based on genuine improvements in the quality of life for ordinary people. The philosophical and intellectual achievements of this period were equally remarkable. Renowned thinkers like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius developed Stoicism into a practical philosophy of life that emphasized duty, virtue, and acceptance of fate. Their writings, filled with wisdom about how to live well in an uncertain world, continue to comfort and inspire readers today. The great historian Tacitus explored the nature of power and its effects on both rulers, and ruled with a cozy, psychological insight that rivals any modern political scientist. Science and medicine advanced as well. Roman physicians built upon Greek medical knowledge to develop surgical techniques and treatments that would not be improved upon for centuries. Roman engineers perfected the use of concrete, created new methods of construction, and developed hydraulic systems of remarkable sophistication. Roman surveyors and mapmakers created the most accurate charts of the known world that had ever existed, while Roman astronomers and mathematicians continued the work of measuring and understanding the cosmos. The prosperity and peace of this golden age was not achieved without cost, of course. The Roman system depended on slavery, and the wealth that flowed into the empire was not always acquired through peaceful means. Yet within the context of its time, the Pax Romana represented an unprecedented achievement in human organization and governance. For nearly 200 years, a vast portion of the inhabited world lived in peace, prosperity, and relative freedom, under a system of law that protected the rights of rich and poor alike. As we reflect on this golden age from our vantage point, in the 21st century, we can appreciate both its achievements and its limitations. The Roman genius lay not in perfection, but in creating a system that worked better than anything that had come before, and better than much that would come after. They showed that it was possible for diverse peoples to live together under common laws, that prosperity could be shared across vast distances, and that civilization could advance through peaceful cooperation rather than violent conquest. The roads they built carried more than goods and travelers. They carried ideas, knowledge, and dreams. The aqueducts brought more than water. They brought the possibility of urban life on a scale never before imagined. The laws they wrote protected more than property. They enshrined principles of justice that would echo through the centuries. When we walk through the ruins of Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash like a snapshot of daily life during the Pax Romana, we can see the comfortable homes, the busy shops, the public buildings that served a thriving community. We can read the graffiti on the walls, jokes, love notes, advertisements, and complaints that remind us that Romans were people much like ourselves, with similar hopes and fears, similar joys and sorrows. The legacy of the Pax Romana extends far beyond the boundaries of the ancient world. The principles of universal law, representative government, public works for the common good, and the integration of diverse peoples under a common system of justice became the foundation stones of Western civilization. When we drive on modern highways, drink water from public utilities, or appeal to courts for justice, we are inheriting gifts that first flourished during those peaceful centuries when Rome ruled the world with wisdom rather than force alone. And so, as we conclude this chapter on Rome's golden age, let us rest in the knowledge that human beings, when freed from the burden of constant warfare and blessed with wise leadership, are capable of creating prosperity, beauty, and justice on a scale that can endure for centuries. The Pax Romana was not perfect, but it was a bright beacon of what civilization might achieve when peace is given the chance to flower. The Roman Empire was not built by committees or guided by democratic assemblies, but shaped by the personalities, ambitions, and character of individual men who held absolute power over the known world. These emperors, some wise, some foolish, some noble, some monstrous, each left their mark upon the vast canvas of Roman civilization. Their stories remind us that power, perhaps more than any force in human affairs, has the capacity to reveal both the very best and the very worst in human nature. Following Augustus, who had established the template for imperial rule, came a succession of men who would test the limits of that system. Some would prove that the Roman world could indeed be governed wisely by a single ruler. Others would demonstrate the terrible dangers inherent in placing unlimited power in the hands of those unworthy to wield it. Let us begin with those who elevated Rome to her greatest heights, the rulers whose names are still spoken with reverence, nearly 2,000 years after their deaths. These were the emperors who understood that true power comes not from fear, but from the willing consent of the governed, not from cruelty, but from justice. Trajan, who reigned from 98 to 117 AD, was perhaps the most beloved of all Roman emperors. Known as one of the 5 good emperors, Trajan expanded the Roman Empire to its greatest territorial extent, pushing into the Sinai Peninsula and Romania through the Dacian and Parthian wars. But it was not conquest alone that made Trajan great. It was his understanding that an empire's true strength lay in the prosperity and contentment of its people. Picture Trajan in his prime, a soldier's emperor, tall and vigorous, equally at home in the Senate debating policy or on the frontier, leading his legions into battle. He possessed that rare combination of military genius and administrative wisdom that made him effective both as a conqueror and as a ruler. His campaigns in Dacia brought vast wealth into the Roman treasury, enough gold and silver to fund public works projects that would benefit ordinary citizens for generations. With this wealth, Trajan transformed Rome herself. His forum, the largest and most magnificent in the city, featured a massive column that still stands today, its spiral reliefs telling the story of his Dacian victories in stone. But more importantly, he used the empire's prosperity to establish a system of financial support for poor children throughout Italy, one of history's first comprehensive social welfare programs. This was leadership that looked beyond personal glory to the long-term well-being of the state and its people. Trajan's greatest achievement, however, may have been his recognition of the limits of Roman power. After his conquests in the east, he could have pushed further into Parthia, deeper into Germania, across the great deserts of Africa. Instead, he chose consolidation over expansion, understanding that an empire must be governable as well as great. He died in 117 AD, having ruled for 19 years of unprecedented prosperity and growth. Not his successor, Hadrian, was a man of entirely different temperament, but equal greatness. Where Trajan had been the soldier emperor, Hadrian was the scholar emperor, a man of vast learning and sophisticated tastes, who traveled throughout his empire, not to conquer, but to understand. He spent more than half his 21-year reign visiting the provinces, inspecting fortifications, founding cities, and personally overseeing the construction of public works. Hadrian's most famous legacy is the Great Wall that bears his name, stretching 73 miles across northern Britain from sea to sea. But this wall was more than just a military fortification. It was a symbol of Rome's commitment to defending what she had, rather than endlessly seeking more. It represented a mature understanding that true security comes not from aggression, but from the ability to protect what one values. The emperor was also a patron of the arts and philosophy on a scale rarely seen in history. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, creating the architectural marvel with its perfect dome that still inspires awe today. He founded the city of Antinopolis in Egypt and personally designed many of its buildings. He wrote poetry, composed music, and engaged in philosophical discussions with the greatest minds of his age. Under his rule, the Roman Empire reached perhaps its highest point of cultural achievement. But it was Marcus Aurelius, the last of the so-called 5 good emperors, who perhaps best embodied the ideal of the philosopher king that Plato had imagined. Centuries earlier, Marcus Aurelius ruled from 161 to 180 CE and was known as the last of the 5 good emperors of Rome and as the author of the philosophical work Meditations. Imagine this remarkable man, emperor of the known world yet devoted to the Stoic philosophy that taught duty, virtue, and acceptance of fate. Marcus Aurelius came to power reluctantly, preferring his books to the burdens of rule. Yet, when duty called, he answered with a dedication that bordered on the heroic. He faced one of the most challenging tasks of any emperor since Augustus, achieving victory in the Marcomannic Wars while battling against a catastrophic plague that struck the ancient world. For much of his reign, he was forced to campaign along the Danube frontier, defending the empire against Germanic tribes while simultaneously dealing with a devastating plague that may have killed as much as 10% of the empire's population. Yet even in these trying circumstances, Marcus Aurelius found time to write his Meditations, personal reflections on duty, mortality, and the proper conduct of life that remain among the most moving and insightful works of philosophy ever written. Reading his words today, we can still feel the weight of responsibility he carried and the grace with which he bore it. "Very little is needed to make a happy life," he wrote. "It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." These great emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, and others like Antoninus Pius and Nerva, demonstrated that absolute power need not corrupt absolutely. They showed that it was possible for a single individual to govern justly, to use unlimited authority in service of the common good, and to leave the world better than they found it. But the Roman system that could produce such greatness was also capable of elevating men to power who would use it for entirely different purposes. The same imperial structure that had enabled the wise rule of Augustus and Trajan would also give the world some of history's most notorious tyrants. Consider Caligula, whose very name has become synonymous with megalomania and cruelty. His short tenure as emperor was marked by extreme cruelty, debauchery, and a descent into madness, demanding senators worship him as a god and ordering arbitrary executions of those he mistrusted. He began his reign with such promise. The beloved, nephew of the popular general Germanicus, handsome, intelligent, and initially generous to the Roman people. But power, unlimited and unchecked, soon revealed the madness that lurked beneath his charming exterior. Caligula became a delusional megalomaniac who wandered the palace throughout the night, flew into public rages, and spoke to the moon and Jupiter as if they were in confidence. The most famous story tells of how he made his horse, Incitatus, a consul, though this may have been intended as an insult to the Senate rather than genuine madness. More disturbing were his genuine atrocities, the arbitrary executions, the sexual depravities, the financial recklessness that nearly bankrupted the state Augustus had left so prosperous. Caligula's reign lasted only 4 years, but they were 4 years that demonstrated the terrible vulnerability of autocratic systems to the whims of unstable personalities. When he was finally assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard in 41 AD, Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief. Yet the damage had been done. The precedent established that an emperor could rule through terror and caprice rather than wisdom and justice. Even more notorious was Nero, whose name has echoed through history as the embodiment of imperial excess and cruelty. Nero's reign was marked by tyranny, extravagance, and the infamous image of an emperor playing the fiddle while Rome burned, described by contemporary sources as tyrannical, self-indulgent, and debauched. The young man who began his reign as a patron of the arts gradually transformed into a monster who murdered his own mother, his wife, and countless others who stood in his way or simply displeased him. Nero's reign coincided with some of the most tragic events in Roman history. The Great Fire that devastated Rome in 64 AD was probably not set by the emperor himself, despite the famous legend, but his response to the disaster revealed his character. While ordinary Romans lost their homes and possessions, Nero used the cleared land to build his enormous golden house, a palace complex so vast and luxurious that it scandalized even the jaded Roman elite. Nero burned Christians as human torches and commenced the process of diluting the precious metal content of Roman money, while exercising total power in service of his often strange desires. His persecution of Christians following the Great Fire was particularly brutal, with believers reportedly used as living torches to illuminate the emperor's garden parties. It was a level of cruelty that shocked even a society accustomed to gladiatorial games and public executions. The contrast between emperors like Marcus Aurelius and tyrants like Caligula and Nero illustrates one of the fundamental problems with autocratic government. It is only as good as the autocrat. The Roman system had no effective mechanism for ensuring that good men would rise to power or for removing bad ones once they were enthroned. The empire was fortunate to have long periods of wise rule, but it was also vulnerable to the devastating effects of tyrannical leadership. Yet even among the notorious emperors, we can sometimes glimpse the humanity that power corrupted. Nero, for all his later crimes, began his reign with genuine attempts at reform. He was guided initially by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, both wise men who tried to channel the young emperor's energies in positive directions. For the first 5 years of his reign, Nero ruled with relative moderation and even wisdom. But gradually, the corrupting influence of unlimited power began to work its poison. Nero's artistic ambitions, which might have been harmless in a private citizen, became dangerous obsessions when backed by imperial authority. His desire to perform on stage, to compete in chariot races, to be praised as a poet and musician. All of this was beneath the dignity of a Roman emperor and shocking to traditional Roman sensibilities. The tragedy of figures like Nero is not just the harm they caused, but the waste of potential they represented. Here was a man with genuine artistic talents and intellectual interests, but power without accountability transformed these gifts into instruments of oppression and excess. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of concentrating too much authority in the hands of any individual. No matter how promising they might initially appear, the empire survived these periods of tyrannical rule largely because of the strength of the institutions Augustus had created. The civil service continued to function. The legions maintained their discipline. The provinces kept sending their taxes, and life for most Romans continued much as it had before. The Roman system was robust enough to withstand even the worst excesses of imperial power, though at a terrible cost in human suffering and squandered resources. Between the extremes of greatness and tyranny were emperors who fell somewhere in the middle, competent administrators, who left the empire neither significantly better nor worse than they found it. Men like Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and successor, who ruled effectively, but with a dour personality that made him unloved by the Roman people. Or Antoninus Pius, whose long reign was marked by peace and prosperity, but little dramatic achievement. These middle emperors remind us that competent, unremarkable leadership can be a blessing in its own right. Not every age requires a Trajan or an Augustus. Sometimes what a civilization needs most is simply steady, honest governance that allows the ordinary business of life to proceed without interference from imperial ambitions or imperial madness. The emperors, who ruled Rome were products of their time, shaped by the expectations and limitations of ancient society. They operated within a system that had no concept of human rights as we understand them today, where slavery was accepted, where women had limited legal standing, where might often made right. Yet even within these constraints, the best of them managed to achieve remarkable things, establishing legal principles that still influence our courts, building infrastructure that lasted for centuries, patronizing arts and literature that continue to inspire us today. Their legacy is complex and contradictory, much like the civilization they ruled. The same empire that produced the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius also produced the cruelty of Caligula. The same system that allowed Trajan to expand Roman civilization to its furthest boundaries also enabled Nero to persecute Christians and waste the empire's resources on personal vanity projects. Perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from the stories of these emperors is the crucial importance of accountability in government. The Roman Empire's greatest achievements came when its rulers, whether through personal virtue or institutional pressure, felt responsible to something greater than their own desires. Its greatest failures occurred when that sense of accountability was lost. As we reflect on these towering figures from the distant past, we can see our own world reflected in theirs. The temptations of power, the corruption of absolute authority, the occasional emergence of truly great leadership, these are constants in human experience. The specific forms may change, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably consistent across the centuries. The Roman emperors, in all their glory and infamy, remind us that civilizations are ultimately shaped by individual human beings making individual human choices. The great ones chose duty over comfort, the welfare of their people over personal pleasure, lasting achievement over temporary gratification. The terrible ones chose the opposite, with predictably tragic results. As the 3rd century draws to a close, dear listener, imagine yourself walking through the cobblestone streets of ancient Rome on a quiet evening. The marble columns of the great temples still stand proud against the twilight sky, their shadows growing long as the sun sets behind the 7 hills. But if you listen carefully, if you pause in the gathering dusk, you might hear something new echoing softly through the narrow alleyways and humble neighborhoods. It's the sound of voices, hushed but hopeful, gathered in small circles behind closed doors. These are the early Christians, and their story is about to change the very soul of the greatest empire the world has ever known. Picture, if you will, the Rome of the late 200s. The great stone aqueducts still carry fresh water from distant mountains, their gentle flow a constant whisper in the background of daily life. The Forum Romanum bustles with merchants and senators, their togas flowing like gentle waves in the warm Mediterranean breeze. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm of imperial life, something profound is stirring, something that began 3 centuries earlier with a humble carpenter from a distant province called Palestine. The early Christians were, at first, just another small group among the many religions that called Rome home. The empire, you see, had always been remarkably tolerant of different faiths, as long as citizens also showed proper respect to the emperor and the traditional Roman gods. Jupiter still ruled from his temple on the Capitoline Hill, Mars still watched over the legions, and Minerva still guided the wise. But these new followers of someone called Christ offered something different, something that whispered to the deepest longings of the human heart. They spoke of love conquering hatred, of hope surviving despair, of a kingdom not of this world, but somehow present within it. In the crowded tenements where slaves and freedmen made their homes, in the grand villas where wealthy Romans pondered the meaning of life, this message began to take root like seeds carried on a gentle wind. Persecution began slowly, almost reluctantly. Emperor Nero, that troubled soul we encountered in our earlier journey, was the first to turn seriously against these Christians, blaming them for the great fire that consumed much of Rome in the year 64. Picture the scene: flames dancing against the night sky, illuminating the anguished faces of citizens fleeing their burning homes, while somewhere in his palace, Nero played his lyre and sang of Troy's destruction. When the people demanded someone to blame, the Christians, already viewed with suspicion for their refusal to worship the emperor, became convenient scapegoats. But persecution, like trying to hold back the tide with one's bare hands, often achieves the opposite of what it intends. For every Christian who fell to the wild beasts in the arena, for every believer who faced the flames with a prayer on their lips, 10 more were inspired by their courage. The blood of martyrs, as one early Christian writer would observe, became the seed of the church. Imagine the feelings of those early believers as they gathered in the catacombs beneath Rome, those vast networks of tunnels where the dead were laid to rest. By flickering candlelight, they would share simple meals of bread and wine, remembering their Savior's Last Supper. The walls around them were decorated not with images of conquest and glory, but with gentle symbols: a fish, a dove, a shepherd carrying a lamb. In these quiet spaces, far from the noise and bustle of the world above, something beautiful was being born. The emperors who followed Nero had varying attitudes toward these growing communities. Some, like Trajan, tried to manage the situation with a kind of benign neglect. Don't seek them out, he instructed his governors. But if they're brought before you and refuse to make sacrifices to the gods, they must be punished. It was a policy born of political pragmatism rather than religious conviction, like a physician treating symptoms while ignoring the underlying condition. Others, like Diocletian near the end of the 3rd century, launched more systematic persecutions. Picture this elderly emperor, tired from decades of trying to hold together an increasingly unwieldy empire, convinced that the gods were angry with Rome for tolerating these Christians. In the year 303, he issued edict after edict. Christian books were to be burned, churches destroyed, clergy imprisoned. Yet even as the flames consumed sacred texts and believers went into hiding, the faith continued to spread through the empire, like morning light gradually illuminating a vast landscape. The Christian communities had something that the traditional Roman religions lacked. While the old gods demanded sacrifices and proper rituals, Christianity offered personal relationship. While the temples were often distant and formal, Christian gatherings were intimate and welcoming. A slave could sit beside a senator. A merchant's wife could worship alongside a poor widow, and all were considered equally beloved children of God. They also offered something else that resonated deeply in an age of uncertainty: hope. The 3rd century had been hard on Rome. Economic troubles, military pressures from barbarian tribes, political instability as emperor after emperor rose and fell. In such times, the promise of a kingdom not subject to earthly decay, of a love stronger than death itself, spoke to hearts hungry for something eternal. As our story moves into the 4th century, we encounter a figure who would change everything: Constantine. Picture him in the year 306, a young man of perhaps 32, standing at the edge of the known world in the Romagna province of Britain. His father, Constantius, has just died, and the legions have proclaimed Constantine emperor of the western provinces. But he is just one claimant among several, and a brutal civil war lies ahead. The story that would transform both Constantine and the empire begins on an October day in the year 312. Constantine is marching toward Rome to face his rival Maxentus. At the Milvian Bridge, the fate of the Western Empire hangs in the balance. According to later accounts, as Constantine prayed for victory, he looked up at the afternoon sun and saw something remarkable: a cross of light with Greek words that translated to, "In this sign, conquer." Whether this vision was literal or symbolic, whether it came in waking hours or in a dream, we cannot say with certainty. What matters is that Constantine believed he had received a divine message. He ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol, the Chi Rho, on their shields. The next day, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Maxentius's forces were utterly defeated. His rival drowned in the Tiber River, and Constantine entered Rome as its undisputed master. But Constantine's conversion, if we can call it that, was a gradual process, like the slow turning of seasons. He didn't immediately declare himself Christian or make Christianity the official religion of the empire. Instead, he took a step that was perhaps even more revolutionary. He chose tolerance. In the winter of 313, Constantine met with Licinius, emperor of the eastern provinces, in the northern Italian city of Milan. Picture this historic meeting. Two of the most powerful men in the world, sitting in a warm room while snow falls softly outside, discussing the future of religious freedom. The document they produced, known to history as the Edict of Milan, was remarkable for its simplicity and wisdom. The edict established that all citizens of the empire should have the liberty to observe the religion of their choice and their particular mode of worship. Christians were no longer to be persecuted for their faith. Their property, confiscated during earlier persecutions, was to be restored. They could build churches, hold public worship, and live openly as followers of Christ. But perhaps most importantly, the edict didn't make Christianity the official religion or ban the worship of traditional gods. It simply said that in this vast empire, there was room for all sincere seekers of the divine. Jupiter and Christ could coexist under Roman law. The sun god and the God of Abraham could both receive worship without the state favoring one over the other. The effects of this decision rippled across the empire like stones thrown into a still pond. In cities from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, Christians emerged from the shadows. They began building churches in prominent locations, no longer hiding in private homes or underground catacombs. Bishops became public figures, consulted by government officials and respected by their communities. Constantine himself remained a complex figure throughout his reign. He delayed his baptism until he was on his deathbed, a common practice in an age when many believed baptism washed away all sins and wanted to ensure they entered eternity in a state of grace. He continued to use pagan symbols on his coins and maintained his role as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the traditional Roman religion. Yet he also presided over the Council of Nicaea in 325, helping to establish fundamental Christian doctrines that endure to this day. The emperor's new capital, Constantinople, built on the site of ancient Byzantium, embodied this blend of old and new. The city's architecture combined traditional Roman grandeur with Christian symbolism. Pagan statues stood alongside Christian mosaics. The hippodrome, where chariot races thrilled the crowds, was decorated with crosses. It was as if Constantine was trying to create a new kind of civilization, one that honored both the achievements of the past and the promises of the future. As Christianity grew from a persecuted minority to a protected religion, the church itself began to change. The simple house churches of the apostolic era gave way to magnificent basilicas. The informal leadership of the early communities evolved into a complex hierarchy of bishops, priests, and deacons. Theological debates, once conducted quietly among small groups of believers, now became matters of imperial concern. This transformation wasn't without its challenges. As Christianity became more acceptable, more fashionable even, some worried that it was losing its radical edge. The emperor himself could now influence church decisions, leading some to wonder whether Caesar had conquered Christ even while appearing to serve him. The Desert Fathers, those remarkable men and women who retreated to the Egyptian wilderness to live lives of prayer and simplicity, represented in part a reaction against this new respectability. Yet for all these complexities, something profound had occurred. The religion that began with 12 ordinary men following a carpenter from Nazareth had become a force that could influence the mightiest empire on earth. The message of love, forgiveness, and eternal hope had proven more powerful than all the legions of Rome. Picture a Christian family in the late 4th century, perhaps living in a comfortable house in Antioch or Alexandria. The father might be a successful merchant, the mother skilled in the domestic arts that kept the household running smoothly. Their children play games in a courtyard where grapevines provide shade from the Mediterranean sun. On Sunday mornings, they walk openly through the city streets to a beautiful church, joining hundreds of other believers in songs of praise and prayers of thanksgiving. This family faces no persecution for their faith. Their neighbors, some Christian, and some still devoted to the old gods, live in peace together. The local magistrate might himself be a Christian, or at least sympathetic to Christian concerns. The empire that once fed believers to lions now protects their right to worship. Yet, as we watch this peaceful scene, we're also witnessing the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Rome that conquered the world through military might and political genius was slowly being transformed by ideas it had once tried to suppress. The empire that had achieved unity through shared citizenship and common law was now finding a different kind of unity in shared faith and common worship. The transformation wasn't complete, of course. Christianity wouldn't become the official state religion until 380 with the Edict of Thessalonica under Emperor Theodosius. Even then, the old ways died hard. Pagan festivals continued, often adapted to Christian purposes. The winter solstice became Christmas. The spring fertility celebrations became Easter. The empire was changing, but it was also finding ways to honor its past while embracing its future. As the 4th century drew to a close, any observer walking through the streets of Rome would have seen a city in transition. The Pantheon, that magnificent temple to all gods, still stood proud beneath the Italian sky, but Christian churches were rising on hills throughout the city. The old Roman virtues of duty, honor, and service to the state were being redefined through Christian concepts of love, humility, and service to God and neighbor. In the great libraries of the empire, Christian scholars were beginning to engage seriously with classical philosophy, finding in Plato and Aristotle ideas that could enrich their understanding of faith. Augustine of Hippo, perhaps the greatest of these early Christian thinkers, would soon write works that blended the best of Roman intellectual tradition with the transformative power of Christian revelation. The revolution that had begun with a handful of believers in Jerusalem had reached its culmination in the heart of the empire, not through conquest or political maneuvering, but through the simple power of a message that spoke to the deepest longings of the human heart. The empire that had been built on the principle that might makes right was slowly learning that love might be the strongest force of all. As we prepare to rest, dear listener, let your mind linger on this remarkable transformation. An empire, known for its roads and aqueducts, its legions and laws, had opened its heart to a different kind of architecture, the building of souls. The same civilization that had perfected the art of war was now learning the more difficult art of peace. The power that had conquered nations was being conquered, gently and gradually, by the radical notion that every human being was beloved of God. And in that quiet transformation, in that gentle revolution of the heart, we see perhaps the most remarkable chapter in Rome's long and storied history. Not the conquest of territories or the accumulation of wealth, but the opening of an entire civilization to the possibility of grace. The empire would face many more challenges in the centuries to come, but it would face them with a different spirit, a different hope, a different understanding of what it meant to be human. In the fading light of our story tonight, as you prepare for peaceful rest, Remember that the greatest revolutions are often the quietest ones, happening not on battlefields, but in hearts. Not through force, but through love. Not through conquest, but through surrender to something greater than ourselves. The Christians of the 4th century understood this truth, and in understanding it, they changed the world. Sleep now, and dream of that ancient Rome where temples and churches stood side by side, where the old wisdom and the new faith learned to walk together, and where the eternal city opened its arms to embrace the eternal kingdom. In those dreams, you might hear the gentle echo of prayers offered in basilicas and the soft whisper of hopes that proved stronger than all the power of empire. Rest well, dear traveler through time, and know that some revolutions are so profound they echo still, rippling through the centuries like light from distant stars, illuminating our path even now as we make our own journey through the mysteries of faith and the adventures of the human heart. As we turn the pages of our Roman story, dear listener, we find ourselves in the twilight hours of the 4th century, watching the sun set slowly over an empire that has grown too vast for one man to govern, too complex for any single vision to guide. The gentle evening light falls across marble columns and cobbled streets, casting long shadows that seem to whisper of endings and new beginnings. Constantine has passed into history, and his sons have divided the empire between them, like brothers sharing their father's estate. But this division, meant to make governance easier, has planted seeds that will grow into something far more profound than anyone could have imagined. We are about to witness the slow, inexorable transformation of the world's greatest empire, not through conquest or catastrophe, but through the simple passage of time and the weight of its own magnificent complexity. Picture, if you will, the Roman world in the year 375. The empire stretches from the foggy shores of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, from the Rhine's cold waters to the warm shores of the Black Sea. It encompasses perhaps 60 million souls, speaking dozens of languages, worshiping in countless ways, yet all calling themselves Romans. The roads still carry merchants and messengers. The aqueducts still bring fresh water to distant cities, and the legions still stand guard on far-flung frontiers. If you were to walk those roads with the eyes of understanding, you would notice subtle changes. The Latin spoken in Gaul carries different accents and expressions than that heard in Rome. The Christianity practiced in Egypt has developed its own traditions and interpretations. The Gothic tribes beyond the Danube have learned Roman military tactics and speak broken Latin with their children. The empire is not just governing diverse peoples. It is slowly becoming something new, something that perhaps cannot be contained within the old boundaries and definitions. The emperor who would oversee this transformation was Theodosius, a man from Spain who brought both strength and wisdom to the purple. Picture him as a thoughtful ruler, someone who understood that the world was changing and that clinging too tightly to the past might break the very thing he was trying to preserve. In 379, he was called to rule the eastern half of the empire, and he quickly proved himself both a capable military commander and a skilled diplomat. But Theodosius faced challenges that would have tested even Augustus himself. The Goths, those tall, fair-haired people from beyond the Danube, were no longer content to remain outside the empire's borders. Driven by pressure from the Huns further east, they sought not just to raid Roman territory, but to settle within it, to become Romans themselves, while maintaining their own identity and customs. The great crisis came in 378, just before Theodosius took power at a place called Adrianople. The Emperor Valens, Theodosius's predecessor, had decided to meet the Gothic threat with traditional Roman methods, a decisive battle that would demonstrate Roman superiority and send the barbarians fleeing back to their forests. But on that August day, as the sun climbed high over the Thracian plain, the Romans learned that the old ways of war were changing. The Gothic cavalry, swift and mobile, swept around the Roman flanks like a summer storm. The legions, those disciplined formations that had conquered the world, found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed. Valens himself fell in the battle, and with him died not just an emperor, but a certain confidence in Roman invincibility. It was as if the empire looked into a mirror and saw for the first time that it was growing old. Theodosius, when he took power, chose a different path. Instead of seeking revenge, he opened negotiations with the Gothic leaders. Picture these remarkable meetings. Roman senators in their togas sitting across from Gothic chieftains in their furs and amber jewelry, working out the terms of a new kind of relationship. The Goths would be allowed to settle in Roman territory, but as allies rather than subjects. They would serve in the Roman army, but under their own commanders. They would follow Roman law, but maintain their own customs. It was a revolutionary arrangement, one that recognized that the empire was no longer strong enough to impose its will on all its neighbors, but was still wealthy and cultured enough to attract them. Rome was learning to share its identity rather than simply impose it, to grow through inclusion rather than conquest. This policy of accommodation extended to religion as well. In 380, Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, making Christianity the official religion of the empire. But this wasn't the harsh imposition of a new faith that some might have expected. Instead, it was more like the empire formally recognizing what had already happened in the hearts of its people. Christianity had become so widespread, so integrated into Roman life, that making it official was simply acknowledging reality. The old gods weren't banned overnight. Temples weren't destroyed en masse. Instead, there was a gradual transition, like autumn slowly giving way to winter. Pagan festivals were transformed into Christian holidays. Ancient temples were converted into churches. The old Roman virtues of courage, honor, and duty were reinterpreted through Christian concepts of faith, hope, and charity. But even as Theodosius was working to hold the empire together through diplomacy and accommodation, he was also making a decision that would reshape the Roman world forever. In 395, on his deathbed, he divided the empire between his two young sons. Arcadius would rule the east from Constantinople, while Honorius would govern the west from Milan and later Ravenna. This division was meant to be temporary, a practical arrangement to help two inexperienced rulers manage their vast inheritance. But like many temporary solutions, it became permanent. The Eastern and Western empires would never be truly reunited again. The world was witnessing the birth of what would become two distinct civilizations: the Byzantine Empire in the East, which would endure for another 1,000 years, and the Western Empire, which would face its final crisis in the century to come. The young Honorius, barely 10 years old when he became emperor, faced challenges that would have daunted his greatest predecessors. The western provinces were under constant pressure from Germanic tribes seeking new homes and new opportunities. The Visigoths under their king Alaric were moving through the Balkans toward Italy. The Vandals were establishing themselves in North Africa. The Franks and Burgundians were settling in Gaul. The Angles and Saxons were crossing the North Sea to Britain. But perhaps the greatest challenge was internal. The Western Empire was slowly running out of money. The costs of maintaining the army, the bureaucracy, and the vast infrastructure that held the empire together were enormous. Yet the economy was struggling. Trade routes were disrupted by constant warfare. Cities were shrinking as people fled to the countryside for safety. The tax base was eroding just when the empire needed resources most. Picture a Roman tax collector in early 5th century Gaul, riding from villa to villa, trying to gather the funds needed to pay the legions. He might find one estate abandoned. Its owners fled to safer lands. Another might be occupied by Gothic settlers who question whether they owe taxes to a government that seems increasingly distant and powerless. A third might be owned by a Christian bishop who argues that the church's resources should be used for charitable works rather than military expenses. The military situation was equally complex. The Roman army was no longer the disciplined force of citizen soldiers that had conquered the Mediterranean. Increasingly, it was composed of barbarian foederati, allied troops who fought for Rome but maintained their own identities and loyalties. These soldiers were often more loyal to their own commanders than to distant emperors they had never seen. The most famous of these commanders was Stilicho, a Vandal by birth who became the power behind the throne in the Western Empire. Picture this remarkable man, tall and dignified, equally at home in a Roman toga or barbarian battle dress, speaking fluent Latin and Gothic, Christian in faith, but pagan in many of his instincts. For nearly 20 years, he held the Western Empire together through a combination of military skill, diplomatic cunning, and sheer force of personality. Stilicho understood that the old Roman way of dealing with barbarians through conquest and subordination was no longer possible. Instead, he worked to integrate them into the empire's defensive system. He married his daughter to Honorius, linking his family to the imperial house. He negotiated with Gothic leaders, offering them land and positions in exchange for military service. He tried to create a new kind of Roman identity that could include both the descendants of Caesar's legions and the children of Germanic warriors. But Stilicho's policies were controversial. Many traditional Romans saw him as a barbarian who was destroying the empire from within. In 408, encouraged by his enemies at court, Honorius ordered Stilicho's execution. With his death, the Western Empire lost its most capable defender, and the forces he had held in check began to move toward their inevitable destination, Rome itself. The sack of Rome by Alaric and his Visigoths in 410 sent shockwaves throughout the civilized world. For 800 years, since the Celtic chieftain Brennus had briefly occupied the city, Rome had stood inviolate. It was not just a city, but a symbol, not just a capital, but the eternal city, the Caput Mundi, the center of civilization itself. Yet when we picture that August day in 410, we must remember that this was not the savage destruction that modern minds might imagine. Alaric was not a barbarian chieftain bent on mindless destruction. He was a Christian, a man who had served in the Roman army, who understood and even admired Roman culture. His troops were disciplined, and the sack was more like a very rough form of tax collection than the end of civilization. The Visigoths took gold and silver, artworks and luxury goods, but they left the city's infrastructure intact. They respected Christian churches and protected civilians who sought sanctuary there. They withdrew after 3 days, leaving Rome damaged but not destroyed, humbled but not eliminated. Still, the psychological impact was enormous. If Rome could fall, what couldn't fall? If the eternal city could be sacked, what was truly permanent in this world? The aftermath of Alaric's sack revealed both the empire's weakness and its remarkable resilience. Honorius, safe in his heavily fortified capital of Ravenna, seemed almost indifferent to Rome's fall. The real capital of the Western Empire was no longer the city of Augustus and Trajan, but this new stronghold built in the marshes of northern Italy, surrounded by water and walls, designed for defense rather than glory. Yet Roman life continued. The Senate still met, though its powers were largely ceremonial. The aqueducts still brought water to the city's inhabitants. The great monuments still stood, testimony to the empire's enduring achievements. Pilgrims still came to visit the churches, built over the tombs of Peter and Paul. Rome was learning to be something new, not the center of a world empire, but the heart of a whale. Christian civilization, not the pattern established by Alaric's sack, would repeat itself several times over the next half-century. In 455, The Vandals under Genseric would sail from North Africa to sack Rome again, this time more thoroughly. In 472, the Germanic general Ricimer would capture the city during a civil war. Each time, Rome would be damaged but not destroyed. Weakened but not eliminated, the emperors who followed Honorius were increasingly powerless figures, often controlled by Germanic generals who held the real power. Valentinian III, Majorian, Anthemius, these names might sound impressive, but they were shadows of the great emperors of the past. The real rulers of the Western Empire were men like Aetius, the last of the Romans, who spent his reign fighting to hold together an empire that was slowly dissolving around him. Aetius's greatest moment came in 451 at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, where he led a coalition of Romans, Visigoths, and other allies against Attila the Hun. Picture this extraordinary scene: the great-grandson of Augustus's soldiers fighting alongside the grandsons of Germanic warriors, united in defense of a civilization that had learned to include them both. The battle was indecisive, but it marked the high-water mark of Hunnic expansion and showed that the empire could still rally its forces when faced with an existential threat. But even Aetius could not solve the fundamental problems facing the Western Empire. The economy continued to decline. The army remained dependent on barbarian troops whose loyalty was uncertain. The government lacked the resources to maintain the vast infrastructure that held the empire together. Most importantly, the empire was losing its sense of identity and purpose. What did it mean to be Roman in the 5th century? The old definitions no longer applied. Citizenship had been extended to all free inhabitants of the empire more than 2 centuries earlier. The army was filled with Germanic soldiers. The church was dominated by men who had never seen the city of Rome. The emperor might be a child, controlled by barbarian generals. The traditional Roman virtues seemed increasingly irrelevant in a world where survival mattered more than honor, where accommodation was more important than conquest. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. In 476, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer decided that the Western Empire no longer needed a Roman emperor. The last emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed and sent into comfortable retirement. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, informing the Eastern Emperor that there was no longer any need for a separate Western Empire. This was not the fall of Rome in the dramatic sense that we might imagine. There were no burning buildings, no massacres, no scenes of apocalyptic destruction. Instead, it was more like the quiet closing of a business that had been losing money for years. The Western Roman Empire simply stopped existing, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Yet, in another sense, Rome did not fall at all. The city remained inhabited, its churches continued to function, its monuments still stood. The Roman legal system continued to influence the laws of the Germanic kingdoms that had replaced imperial rule. Latin remained the language of learning and diplomacy. The idea of Rome, the dream of universal civilization, continued to inspire kings and emperors for centuries to come. In Gaul, the Frankish kingdoms would eventually give birth to the Carolingian Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. In Britain, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would maintain Roman administrative practices and legal traditions. In Italy, the Ostrogothic kingdom would try to preserve Roman culture and institutions. Even the barbarian invaders wanted to be Romans. They just wanted to be Romans on their own terms. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not the end of civilization, but its transformation. The empire that had begun with the ambitions of a single city had grown too large for any single authority to govern. Like a mighty tree that has grown too tall for its roots to support, it slowly split apart, each branch developing its own identity while remaining connected to the common trunk. As we reflect on this great transformation, dear listener, we might think of it as the empire learning to let go. The Romans had always been a practical people, and perhaps their greatest practicality was recognizing when it was time to change. The Western Empire fell not because it was conquered, but because it was no longer necessary. The civilization it had created, the values it had promoted, the systems it had established, all these continued to exist and influence the world long after the last emperor had been pensioned off. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced Roman rule were not barbarian states, but Roman successor states. Their kings wore Roman titles. Their laws were based on Roman models. Their administrators were often former Roman officials. They didn't destroy Roman civilization. They inherited it, adapted it, and passed it on to their own children. In the quiet monasteries of Ireland and Scotland, monks were copying Roman texts and preserving Roman learning. In the courts of Visigothic Spain and Frankish Gaul, Roman law and Roman administrative practices continued to shape government. In the Italian cities, Roman merchants continued to trade with Roman techniques and Roman commercial law. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. The civilization that had begun with Romulus and Remus, that had grown through the Republic and flourished under the Empire, was now ready to take new forms, to adapt to new circumstances, to continue its journey through history in ways that its founders could never have imagined. As you prepare for sleep tonight, dear friend, let your mind rest on this truth, that the greatest civilizations are not those that last forever unchanged, but those that learn to adapt, to transform, to pass their gifts on to new generations in new forms. The Western Roman Empire fell as a political entity, but Roman civilization continued to shape the world and continues to shape it still. As our long journey through the corridors of Roman history draws to its close, dear listener, imagine yourself standing in the Colosseum on a quiet evening in our modern world. The crowds have gone home, the tour guides have finished their talks, and you are alone with the ancient stones beneath a sky full of stars. The same stars that shone down on Caesar crossing the Rubicon, on Augustus proclaiming the Pax Romana, on Constantine seeing his vision of the cross. Here, in this moment of stillness, surrounded by nearly 2,000 years of weathered marble and brick, you can almost hear the whispers of history. Not the roar of the crowd or the clash of gladiators, but something softer, more enduring. It's the voice of Rome itself, speaking across the centuries, reminding us that some things, once created with love and wisdom, never truly die. The Roman Empire ended, yes, but Roman civilization lives on all around us, woven so deeply into the fabric of our modern world that we often forget to notice it. Like the air we breathe or the ground we walk upon, Rome's influence has become so fundamental to our way of life that we take it for granted. Yet if you know where to look, if you listen with the right ears, you can find Rome everywhere. Through any city in the Western world, and you're walking on Roman roads. Oh, not the same stones that Caesar's legions marched upon, but roads built on the same principles of engineering that Roman surveyors perfected 2 millennia ago. The concept of connecting distant places with straight, well-built highways that could carry both trade and armies. The idea that good roads are the foundation of civilization. This is Rome's gift to every traveler who has ever journeyed from one place to another. In Paris, the Boulevard Saint-Germain follows the exact path of a Roman road. In London, the ancient waddling street still carries traffic as it has for nearly 2,000 years. In modern Germany, the autobahns often trace routes first mapped by Roman engineers. Even in America, far from the original empire's borders, our interstate highway system reflects Roman principles of straight lines, efficient construction, and the understanding that connecting people connects nations. But Rome's influence goes far deeper than roads and bridges. Consider the language you speak, whether it's English, French, Spanish, Italian, or Portuguese. More than half the words in English come from Latin roots. When you talk about justice, liberty, republic, citizen, senate, democracy, you're speaking Roman concepts and Roman words. The very vocabulary of freedom, the terms we use to discuss government and law, these are Rome's gift to the modern world. Think about this. When Americans pledge allegiance to their republic, they're using a Romang word to describe a Roman concept. When the French celebrate liberty, equality, and fraternity, they're invoking Roman ideals in Roman language. When we speak of civil rights, public service, or the rule of law, we're drawing from a well that Roman philosophers and lawmakers dug 20 centuries ago. The American founding fathers knew this. When they gathered in Philadelphia to create a new nation, they didn't look to Athens for their model of democracy. They looked to Rome for their model of republican government. The Capitol building in Washington, with its great dome and classical columns, is a deliberate echo of Roman architecture. The Senate, with its traditions of debate and deliberation, follows procedures that would have been familiar to Cicero. The concept of checks and balances, of separating power so that no single person can become a tyrant. This wisdom comes straight from Roman political theory. But it's not just in America that Rome's political influence lives on. The European Union, with its complex system of laws applying to diverse peoples and cultures, is in many ways an attempt to recreate the Roman Empire's achievement of unity in diversity. The idea that different nations can maintain their identities while sharing common laws and institutions. This is essentially what Rome accomplished across the Mediterranean world. In courtrooms around the world, judges apply principles of law that Roman jurists developed and refined. The presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, the concept that laws should be written down and publicly known, these aren't natural rights that humans always possessed. They're innovations developed through centuries of Roman legal thinking and practice. When a judge in London says habeas corpus, requiring that prisoners be brought before a court, she's using a Latin phrase that embodies a Roman principle. When an American court applies the concept of precedent, letting previous decisions guide current ones, it's following a system that Roman lawyers perfected. When the International Criminal Court prosecutes war criminals, it's applying concepts of universal law that Roman philosophers first articulated. Even our calendar reflects Roman influence. The months we use from January named for Janus to December, originally the 10th month, these are Roman inventions. Julius Caesar gave us the leap year. Augustus gave us the month of August. When we date a letter or schedule a meeting, we're using a system that Roman administrators created to coordinate activities across their vast empire. The Christian Church, which survived the empire's fall and helped preserve its legacy, is perhaps Rome's most enduring institutional achievement. The Pope, from the Latin papa, meaning father, governs from Rome itself, maintaining a direct link to the ancient city. The Church's organization, with its hierarchy of bishops and priests, its system of canon law, its concept of universal authority, all these reflect Roman administrative principles adapted to spiritual purposes. When the Pope speaks ex cathedra, from the chair of authority, he's using a Roman concept of official pronouncement. When Catholic churches around the world celebrate Mass in similar ways, they're demonstrating the Roman genius for creating unity through shared practices. The very idea of a universal church, a single institution that can encompass different cultures while maintaining common beliefs. This is Roman organizational thinking applied to Christian faith. But Rome's influence extends beyond law and government, and religion into the realm of culture and art. Walk through any major museum, and you'll see Roman influence everywhere. Not just in the Roman sculptures and frescoes, but in the Renaissance paintings that rediscovered Roman techniques, in the neoclassical buildings that house the collections, in the very concept of a public museum where art is preserved and displayed. For all to see. The great universities of Europe, from Oxford to the Sorbonne, from Bologna to Salamanca, all trace their academic systems back to Roman models. The idea of a liberal arts education, of studying literature, rhetoric, history, and philosophy to create well-rounded citizens, this comes from Roman educational philosophy. When students today study the classics, learn to think critically, and develop skills in writing and speaking, they're following an educational path that Roman teachers laid out centuries ago. Even our entertainment reflects Roman influence. The great stadiums where we watch football and baseball, with their carefully designed seating and efficient crowd management, are descendants of Roman amphitheaters. The concept of public entertainment, of games and spectacles funded by the state or wealthy individuals for the enjoyment of all citizens, this too is a Roman innovation. When we watch the Olympics, we're participating in a celebration that, while Greek in origin, was preserved and promoted throughout the Roman world. The idea that athletic competition can bring different peoples together, that sports can be a form of diplomacy and cultural exchange. This understanding was developed and refined in Roman arenas and Hippodromes. In the realm of engineering and architecture, Rome's influence is everywhere. The dome of the United States Capitol is a direct descendant of the Pantheon's dome. The arches that support our bridges and buildings use principles that Roman engineers perfected. The concept of concrete, that miraculous building material that allowed the Romans to construct the Colosseum and the baths of Caracalla, was lost for centuries after the empire's fall and only rediscovered in modern times. Aqueducts still carry water to modern cities using Roman engineering principles. Sewage systems still protect public health using Roman concepts of sanitation. The very idea that government has a responsibility to provide clean water and waste management to its citizens. This is a Roman innovation that we now take for granted. But perhaps Rome's greatest legacy is more subtle and profound than any of these practical achievements. It's the idea that different peoples, with different languages and customs and beliefs, can live together in peace under common laws and shared institutions. It's the concept that human civilization can grow and develop, that progress is possible, that the future can be better than the past. The Romans were the first people to truly believe in the possibility of universal human civilization. They didn't just conquer territories. They invited the conquered to become Romans themselves. They didn't just impose their culture. They absorbed and adapted the best elements of other cultures. They created the first truly multicultural society, where a person could be Roman in Gaulish, Roman in Egyptian, Roman in Spanish, all at the same time. This vision of inclusive civilization, of unity and diversity, continues to inspire us today. When we speak of international law, of human rights, of global cooperation, we're drawing on Roman ideas about what human society can become. The United Nations, with its attempt to create institutions that can govern relations between different nations and cultures, is in many ways an attempt to recreate Rome's achievement on a global scale. The European Union, with its motto, United in Diversity, explicitly acknowledges this Roman heritage. The idea that sovereign nations can maintain their independence while sharing common laws and institutions, that trade and diplomacy can be more powerful than warfare, that civilization advances through cooperation rather than conquest. All these principles were first tested and proven in the Roman world. Even in our personal lives, we live by Roman values often without realizing it. When we believe in the importance of duty and service, when we value hard work and discipline, when we think that education and culture are important, we're reflecting Roman virtues. When we believe that laws should apply equally to all people, regardless of their background, when we think that government should serve the people rather than the other way around, we're embracing Roman political philosophy, the Roman concept of pietas, often translated as duty, but really meaning a deep sense of responsibility to family, community, and country, still shapes how we think about citizenship and social obligation. The Roman virtue of gravitas, that dignity and seriousness of purpose that marked the best Roman leaders, is still something we look for in our own political leaders. But Rome's legacy isn't just about grand political and cultural achievements. It's also about the small, everyday things that make life civilized and pleasant. The Romans invented the apartment building, creating the first urban lifestyle that allowed large numbers of people to live comfortably in cities. They developed the shopping mall, building great covered markets where merchants could sell their wares protected from weather and thieves. They created the spa, the resort, the hotel, the restaurant, all the institutions that made travel and leisure possible. They invented the newspaper, the almanac, the cookbook, the travel guide. They developed banking systems, insurance policies, and business contracts that are still used today. They created the concepts of copyright and trademark, protecting intellectual property so that innovation could be rewarded. In medicine, Roman physicians developed surgical techniques and medical instruments that weren't improved upon for more than 1,000 years. They understood the importance of public health, creating hospitals and medical schools. They developed the concept of quarantine, using isolation to prevent the spread of disease. Roman farmers developed agricultural techniques that are still used today. They created the first systematic approaches to crop rotation, soil management, and selective breeding. They developed new varieties of grapes, olives, and grains that are still cultivated. They understood that good farming depends on understanding the land, the climate, and the natural cycles of growth and rest. But perhaps most importantly, the Romans understood that civilization is not just about grand achievements, but about daily life lived with dignity and purpose. They created the idea of the public bath, the public library, the public park, all the institutions that make cities livable and pleasant. They understood that a good society is one where ordinary people can live decent lives, where children can be educated, where the elderly can be cared for, where everyone has access to the basic necessities of life. This Roman vision of the good life, of civilization as the art of living well together, continues to inspire us. When we work to create better schools, better hospitals, better parks and libraries, we're continuing the Roman project of building human civilization one institution at a time. As you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, dear listener, surrounded by the conveniences and securities of modern life, remember that you are the inheritor of a dream that began in ancient Rome. The electric lights that illuminate your room, the running water in your pipes, the books on your shelves, the laws that protect your rights, the roads that connect you to the wider world, all these are part of Rome's continuing gift to humanity. The laptop or smartphone you might use to listen to these words, connected to a global network that allows instant communication with people around the world, represents the fulfillment of a Roman dream of universal connectivity and shared information. The Romans built roads to connect their empire. We have built the internet to connect our world. The principle is the same, that human beings are meant to be connected, that isolation is the enemy of civilization, that progress comes through sharing knowledge and experience. The democracy you participate in, the laws that govern your society, the schools that educated you, the hospitals that care for your health, the museums that preserve your culture. All these institutions trace their lineage back to Roman innovations and Roman ideals. You are living in a world that Rome made possible, breathing air that is still filled with Roman ideas and Roman dreams. But Rome's greatest gift to us may be the understanding that civilization is not a destination but a journey. The Romans didn't achieve perfection. They created the possibility of progress. They showed us that human societies can grow and develop, that the future can be better than the past, that problems can be solved through reason and cooperation and goodwill, They also showed us that civilizations, like individual lives, go through cycles of growth and decline, of achievement and loss. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a failure, but a transformation, not an ending, but a new beginning. The Roman legacy lived on in new forms, adapted to new circumstances, continuing to grow and evolve. This is perhaps the most comforting lesson of Roman history, that good things, once created, have a way of surviving even the most dramatic changes. The empire fell, but Roman law continued to influence legal systems. The legions disbanded, but Roman military principles continued to guide armies. The emperors disappeared, but Roman concepts of leadership and governance continued to shape governments. In the same way, the good things we create in our own lives, the love we give, the kindness we show, the knowledge we share, these too have a way of surviving and continuing to influence the world long after we're gone. We are all part of the same great human story that began in ancient Rome, the story of civilization slowly growing and developing, of human beings learning to live together with dignity and purpose. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let your mind rest on this beautiful truth, that you are connected to everyone who has ever worked to make the world a little bit better, a little bit more civilized, a little bit more humane. The Roman senator who worked to create just laws, the Roman engineer who built roads to connect distant peoples, the Roman teacher who educated children, the Roman doctor who healed the sick, all these people were your ancestors in the great human family, and their work continues in your work. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but the Roman dream lives on in every act of justice, every work of beauty, every gesture of kindness, every effort to build something that will outlast our own brief lives. The eternal city was never really a place, but an idea. The idea that human beings can create something permanent and beautiful and good, something worthy of the precious gift of consciousness that we've been given. Sleep now, dear friend, and dream of that ancient Rome where philosophers walked marble porticos discussing the meaning of life, where engineers designed aqueducts that would carry water for centuries, where lawmakers created principles of justice that would guide nations. Yet unborn, dream of the continuity of human aspiration, of the way good ideas echo through the ages, of the eternal conversation between past and future that we are all privileged to join. In your dreams, you might hear the gentle sound of water flowing through Roman aqueducts, carrying life to distant cities. You might see Roman roads stretching toward the horizon, connecting peoples and cultures in an endless web of human connection. You might feel the presence of all those who came before us and all those who will come after, united in the great human project of building civilization together. And when you wake tomorrow morning, you'll wake as a citizen of that eternal city, inheritor of Roman dreams and Roman achievements, responsible for carrying forward the great work of human civilization, adding your own chapter to the story that began on the 7 hills beside the Tiber and continues still, wherever human beings gather to create something beautiful and lasting and good. The Roman Empire ended, but Rome itself is eternal, living on in every heart that dreams of justice, every mind that seeks truth, every hand that builds something meant to endure. You are Rome's child, dear listener, heir to the greatest civilization the world has ever known, and this story continues. With you, rest well, and let the echoes of eternity sing you gently to sleep.